The summer Wyatt Mercer turned 29. He did what he always did when something threatened to crack open a feeling he didn't want to examine. He fixed a fence. It was the third section of the east pasture that had gone down overnight, probably where the ground had softened after the rains 2 weeks back, and he'd been meaning to get to it since Monday. It was Thursday now. He pulled the truck around at first light, loaded the post hole digger and a half-dozen treated posts into the bed, and drove out before the valley had properly woken up, before the heat had settled its full weight onto the land. He liked it that way. Early, quiet, before anyone could find him and ask how he was doing. Redstone Valley in the summer of 1889 was not a quiet place by nature. It was a working country, cattle country, mostly, though there were sheep operations north of town and a few homestead farmers trying their luck with winter wheat in the lower flats. The town itself sat between two ridgelines with a creek running through it, Cutter's Creek they called it, named for the original surveyor who'd mapped the territory 30 years back. The town had a proper main street now, a hardware store, a post office, 2 saloons, a livery, and Evelyn Hart's bakery on the south end of Commerce Street, which had been there for 4 years and which most people in the valley considered the best argument for civilization that Redstone had to offer. Wyatt's ranch sat about a mile east of town proper, 43 acres his father had broken, and his mother had shaped into something that felt like home, back when there were 3 of them. Now there were cattle and a dog named Gus, and more fence line than any one man could reasonably maintain alone. But Wyatt had been managing it alone for 6 years, and he'd gotten good at not noticing how quiet the house was at night. He drove the fence posts while the dew was still on the grass, working methodically, the way he did everything. Measure, dig, set, tamp. The digger bit into the rocky soil, and he muscled through it, sweat starting across his shoulders before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge. Gus lay in the shade of the truck and watched him with the benevolent disinterest of a dog who'd seen this routine enough times that it no longer required active observation. He was on the 4th post when he heard it, a thin, strained noise from somewhere across the creek. Not an animal sound, not quite. He straightened up and looked south. The Hart property sat across Cutter's Creek from his east pasture, separated by the water and a stand of cottonwoods that had grown up along the bank over the last decade. The Harts ran a kitchen garden and kept a few chickens and a milk cow, supplemented by what Evelyn earned at the bakery. Her parents were both alive, but her father, Clarence Hart, had been slowing down for 2 or 3 years now, his hands giving him trouble, his back worse in the mornings, and Evelyn had quietly taken on more of what he could no longer manage without making any fuss about it. What Wyatt could see from where he stood was Evelyn herself, over by the vegetable rows, trying to wrestle a section of collapsed garden fencing back into position while holding a corner of it with her knee and attempting to drive a stake into the ground one-handed. She was not succeeding. The stake kept falling. The fencing kept listing. She made a sound of frustration that wasn't a word exactly, just the noise a person makes when they've been fighting something small and losing for longer than is reasonable. Wyatt watched for a moment. He was not a man who inserted himself easily into other people's situations. He'd been raised to mind his own, to let folks handle what was theirs, to not make himself a nuisance. These were values he held genuinely, not as social performance. But there was also something else in the watching, a hesitation that had nothing to do with manners and everything to do with the particular discomfort he felt whenever he let himself look directly at Evelyn Hart for more than a few seconds. He looked away, turned back to his post, tamped it down, moved to the 5th position, measured. The noise from across the creek happened again, sharper this time, and then there was a brief clatter that suggested the whole section had gone down properly now, and Wyatt put down the measuring tape and walked to the creek bank. "You need a hand with that?" he called. She looked up from this collapsed fencing. Her dark hair was pulled back, but a piece of it had come loose on one side. She had dirt on her forearms and what looked like a streak of something, mud or maybe beet juice from the row she'd been working near, across the front of her apron. "I'm fine," she said. He looked at the fencing, which was comprehensively not fine. "The posts rotted through at the base," he said. "You can see it from here. Driving a new stake next to a rotted post won't hold." She looked at the post, then back at him. "I know that," she said in a tone that suggested she had, in fact, just figured that out. "I've got spare posts in the truck." A beat of silence. She had the look of a person calculating whether accepting help was going to cost her something she wasn't willing to pay. "It's just garden fence," she said. "It's also still falling down," he said. She put her hands on her hips and considered him across the water. The creek was shallow enough to cross in 3 steps. It always had been. He'd crossed it dozens of times over the years to help her father with this or that, to return borrowed tools, to drop off the occasional haunch of beef when he'd butchered more than he could use. It was just 20 feet of moving water. It shouldn't have felt like anything particular. "All right," she said finally. "Thank you." He went back to the truck for posts and the digger. None. It took 40 minutes. The rotted post came out in pieces, the wood soft and crumbling at the base the way untreated timber went after enough wet winters. Wyatt dug the new hole, set the post, tamped it solid while Evelyn held the top to keep it plumb. They worked without much conversation, the comfortable rhythm of 2 people who'd lived adjacent to each other long enough to have developed a kind of wordless coordination on practical tasks. When the fence was back up and the wire restretched and stapled, Evelyn stepped back and tested it with her hand. It held. "That'll do," she said. "Should hold through the season if the weather doesn't get too bad," Wyatt said. She nodded. She was doing that thing she did sometimes, looking at him with an expression he could never quite read, something between assessment and patience, like she was waiting for him to get to some point he hadn't made yet. "Coffee?" she said. "Mother just put a pot on. I've got the east fence to finish. It'll be there in 20 minutes. That was true. The fence was not going anywhere. He knew it. She knew it. And they both knew that saying yes to coffee on a Thursday morning in late June was exactly the kind of small, ordinary thing that didn't mean anything at all and also, somehow, meant something. "All right," he said. They went inside. The Hart House was a 2-story frame house, smaller than Wyatt's but better kept, with a vegetable garden on 3 sides, and flower boxes in the windows that were Evelyn's mother's project. Margaret Hart was 61 years old, a small, precise woman who had come west with her husband before the railroad reached this part of the territory and had never particularly softened for the frontier the way some women did. She made good coffee and kept a tight house and had decided opinions about most things, which she delivered in a measured tone that made them sound like observations rather than judgments, even when they were plainly both. She was at the stove when they came in, and she looked at Wyatt over her shoulder with an expression that could have been surprise but probably wasn't. "Wyatt," she said. "Morning, Mrs. Hart. Sit down. I'll pour." Clarence was at the table with the newspaper, moving slowly through the pages with the careful deliberation of a man whose hands hurt but who refused to acknowledge it. He lifted a hand when Wyatt sat across from him and said, "Fence give out again?" "Post rotted through," Wyatt said. "I told Evelyn about that post in April," Clarence said, in the neutral tone of a man registering facts rather than blaming anyone. "I know you did, Papa," Evelyn said, from the other side of the kitchen. She said it without defensiveness, just acknowledging it, the way she acknowledged most things, directly, without decoration. Margaret put cups in front of them, and Wyatt wrapped both hands around his and felt the steam come up and thought, not for the first time, that the Hart kitchen was one of the few places in the valley where he didn't feel the need to be doing something productive. There was a smell in it, baking that Evelyn had brought from the bakery the afternoon before, plus coffee and something herbal from the windowsill, and the particular good smell of a house that had been thoroughly lived in, that did something to the tight place behind his sternum that he mostly kept from thinking about. "Drought's looking bad," Clarence said. 2 weeks with nothing," Wyatt said. "Creek's down a foot from where it was in May." "Ridley's going to lose half his herd if it doesn't break," Clarence said. Frank Ridley had the biggest cattle operation in the valley, 300 head, and his pastures north of town were showing the strain. "Already seen it in the bakery," Evelyn said. She sat down across from her father with her own cup, and she had that quality she sometimes had of being both very present in the room and economical about it, like she took up exactly the space that was hers, and no more. "People aren't buying the way they were in May. When cash is tight, bread from home comes before bread from the bakery." "That's sensible," Wyatt said. "It's practical," she agreed. There was no self-pity in it. It was just a thing that was true. Margaret said from the stove, "You eating properly out at the ranch, Wyatt?" "I eat fine." "Because you look like you've dropped weight since spring." "Mother," Evelyn said mildly. "I'm just observing," Margaret said. She turned back to the stove. "He's always been too thin. Even when he was 16 he was too thin. You remember that, Clarence?" "He worked it off," Clarence said to his newspaper. Wyatt drank his coffee and felt the particular warmth of being discussed by a family that had known him most of his life. The strangeness of it, the discomfort, and the comfort of it tangled up together. The Harts had been his nearest neighbors since before his mother died. Margaret had brought food to the house for 2 weeks after the funeral, had been there when he and his father had stood in that kitchen and not known what to say to each other or to anyone. He'd been 23 years old, and his father had died the following winter. A chest sickness that took him fast. And after that, there had been no one bringing food, because a 24-year-old man doesn't get the casseroles that a grieving family does. He'd figured it out. He'd kept the ranch going. He'd built the wall around himself so carefully, brick by brick, that he'd stopped noticing it was there. "How's business overall?" he asked Evelyn, because asking about the bakery was neutral, safe. "Steady," she said. "I picked up an account with the hotel in March. They take 24 rolls a day, which helps with the fixed costs. Summer weddings are good. I'm doing the Calloway wedding in 3 weeks." A pause. That should be interesting. The way she said interesting had something in it. "Thomas Calloway getting married?" Wyatt said. "To Dora Finch." "Yes." Another pause, this one shorter. "Thomas did ask to call on me last fall." Wyatt's coffee cup stopped halfway to the table. He set it down. He looked at the surface of the table and then, with some effort, back at Evelyn, who was watching him in that particular patient way. "I didn't know that," he said. "There wasn't any reason you would. Did you—" He stopped. "That's none of my business." "I didn't encourage it," she said. "We had a pleasant enough afternoon on his porch, and I told him I wasn't interested in anything beyond being neighborly, and he took it graciously and apparently moved on to Dora Finch, which seems to have worked out for everyone." Margaret, at the stove, was very carefully not looking at either of them. Clarence turned a page of his newspaper. "That was good of him," Wyatt said, taking it graciously. "Most men do," Evelyn said, "when they've had time to think it through." He couldn't tell if she was saying something particular with that or if he was reading something into it that wasn't there. He never could tell with her. That was part of the problem. He finished his coffee and stood up. "I should get back to the fence." "Of course," she said. He thanked Margaret, said goodbye to Clarence, walked back across the creek to his truck and his fence posts and his measuring tape, and stood for a moment with his hand on the side of the truck bed, looking at nothing in particular, and then he picked up the digger and went back to work. The drought held. Through July, the sky stayed clear in the way that looks beautiful from a distance and is brutal if you're watching your pasture go brown. Wyatt moved his cattle to the lower acreage, where the creek kept more moisture in the ground, cut back the herd by 7 head to take the pressure off his grazing, and spent most of his evenings after supper doing the kind of financial arithmetic that was not encouraging. He wasn't alone in it. The whole valley was calculating. He heard it at the hardware store, at the feed supplier. In the quick conversations that happened outside the post office when 2 ranchers ended up there at the same time and the subject of the weather came up naturally, which meant immediately because there was no subject more pressing. Frank Ridley, who had more land and more debt than anyone in the valley, was loud about his troubles in the way that men who are genuinely frightened sometimes are. He talked about the drought at Hennessy's saloon and at the feed store and at the town council meeting that Wyatt attended in mid-July, where the main topic was the possibility of digging a secondary irrigation channel off Cutter's Creek to serve the north pastures. "It's not a fair distribution of a public resource," said Ridley at the meeting. He was a big man, 52, with a red complexion that deepened when he was making an argument. "I run the largest operation in this valley. I employ more men than any other ranch. If my operation fails, this whole valley feels it." "We all run smaller operations than yours, Frank," said a man named Dale Sutton, who ran sheep north of town. "That doesn't mean we matter less." "I'm not saying you matter less. I'm saying the math is the math." Wyatt, sitting in the third row, said nothing. He was there to listen, mostly. He'd learned that most public meetings resolved themselves through exhaustion rather than resolution, and that the most useful thing you could do was wait until the exhausted consensus emerged and then figure out whether you could live with it. What emerged after an hour and a half was that the irrigation proposal would be studied further by a committee, which meant it was not going to happen before the drought broke or killed whatever needed killing. This was not a surprise. After the meeting broke up, Wyatt was making his way toward the door when he nearly ran into Evelyn, who had been sitting in the back row, which he hadn't known. She was there with her father's interests in mind. The Harts didn't have enough land to be represented in their own right at a ranchers' meeting, but they depended on the creek as much as anyone. "Evening," he said. "Evening." She looked over his shoulder toward where Ridley was still talking at two men who were trying to leave. "He's going to get that irrigation channel," she said. "Not this year, but eventually." "Probably," Wyatt agreed. "And when he does, the creek level's going to drop." "Yes." She looked at him then. "That'll affect your east pasture and our kitchen garden." "I know." "Are you planning to say anything about it to the committee?" He hesitated. "I'll put it in writing." She made a small sound that might have been skepticism and might have been something else. "Writing's good," she said, "but a warm body in the room tends to count for more." "You could be that warm body," he said. "I could," she said. "But they'd listen to you more than they'd listen to me, and you know that." He did know that. He didn't like it, but he knew it. "I'll go to the next committee meeting," he said. "Good." She pulled her shawl around her shoulders. The evenings were cooling even if the days were brutal, and looked at him again. "How are you holding up?" "With the drought." "Managing." She waited in the way she had, as if managing was not a complete answer, and she was giving him the space to produce one if he was going to. He didn't. "Well," she said, "come by if you need anything." She went out ahead of him into the dusty street, and he stood in the doorway of the town hall and watched her walk south toward where she'd tied her horse, and felt the familiar combination of wanting to say something and having no idea what exactly that something was supposed to be. August came in hotter. He took a load of cattle to the auction in the county seat and got decent prices. Not what he'd have liked, but decent, and used the money to pay down the feed debt he'd been carrying since spring and put a small amount back against the mortgage. He was not in trouble, not exactly, but he was closer to the edge than he'd been in a couple of years, and the margin made him careful. There were 3 men in the valley who found reasons to be attentive to Evelyn Hart that summer. Wyatt was aware of this without entirely meaning to be. One was a new man in town, a surveyor named Paul Garrett, who'd come in with a mining company doing exploratory work in the eastern hills. He was 35, presentable, easy in conversation, the kind of man who made social interaction look effortless in the way that people who'd grown up in cities often did. He bought bread at Evelyn's bakery with noticeable regularity and had, according to information Wyatt absorbed without seeking it out, invited her to a dance at the Grange Hall in late July. He didn't know if she went. He didn't ask. The second was a widower named George Albrecht, a German farmer who'd come into the valley 4 years ago with his wife and 2 boys, and whose wife had died the previous winter of a fever that moved fast. He was a solid, quiet man, 40 years old, who needed a mother for his boys and was practical enough to understand that and not pretend otherwise. He had stopped at the bakery several times and had, Wyatt heard from Sutton, who'd heard from his wife, brought Evelyn a jar of honey from his hives, which was either a practical gift or a romantic one, depending on how you read it. The third was Thomas Calloway's younger brother, Marcus, who was 26, and who had apparently been watching Evelyn from a respectful distance for some time, and had now, with his brother's engagement concluded, decided to make less of a distance of it. He rode past the bakery at times that were not entirely explained by his ranching schedule. None of this was Wyatt's business. He told himself this repeatedly, and believed it imperfectly. On an evening in the 3rd week of August, he was working late at the fence line again. Different section this time, the northwest corner where the cattle had been pressing, when he saw Evelyn riding home from town along the creek road. She had a basket on the saddle horn, and she was moving at an easy pace, not in any hurry, and in the long amber light of late afternoon she looked very particular and very much like something he was going to regret not doing anything about. She saw him and raised a hand. He raised one back. She kept riding. He stood there for a minute with his hammer in his hand and Gus sitting at his feet, and the creek making its usual sound, and the light doing what it did at that hour in August. And he thought about 6 years of managing fine and the way the Hart kitchen smelled on a Thursday morning, and the expression on Evelyn's face when she was waiting for him to say something he wasn't saying. He thought about his mother, who had been the person who made that ranch a place worth coming home to, and how after she was gone, his father had turned inward and quiet in a way that Wyatt had watched for 2 years and then inherited without meaning to. He thought about Paul Garrett, easy and presentable and unafraid. He picked up a fence staple and drove it in with 3 clean strokes, and didn't think about anything at all for a while after that. The last Sunday of August, he went to the Grange Hall social. He didn't ordinarily go to social events. He went to the necessary public meetings, to the feed store and the hardware store, to the auction when he had to. Socials were another thing. They required a kind of easy presence he didn't naturally have, the ability to stand around with a cup of punch and talk about nothing in particular and seem like that was sufficient. But he went. He told himself he went because Dale Sutton had specifically said he should show up, that the committee discussion about the irrigation channel was going to have an informal continuation at the social, and that his voice would be useful. This was partially true. Dale had said that. The hall was strung with lanterns, and someone had brought a fiddle and a guitar, and the dancing was already started when Wyatt arrived. He found Dale, and they talked for 20 minutes about the irrigation situation and the drought, and the relative merits of 2 different proposals for the channel route, which was genuinely useful and also gave Wyatt something to do with himself. He saw Evelyn across the room shortly after he arrived. She was talking to Margaret Sutton and a woman he didn't recognize, and she was wearing a dress he hadn't seen before, a deep blue the color of the sky just after the sun goes down. And she was laughing at something Margaret had said in the way that she laughs sometimes, with her whole face in it, not the careful social laugh, but the real one. He looked away. He talked to Dale. He talked to 2 men he knew from the auction circuit. He had some of the punch, which was good, and some of the food, which was better, and he positioned himself with his back to the wall as he usually did in social situations, and watched the dancing from a distance and told himself this was perfectly fine. Paul Garrett asked Evelyn to dance. Wyatt watched her consider it from across the room, watched her nod, watched them move onto the floor together. Garrett was a good dancer, of course he was, and Evelyn was light on her feet in a way Wyatt hadn't known before seeing it. They looked well together, the kind of match that the room noticed. Margaret Sutton said something to her husband. Dale's wife, Clara, caught Wyatt's eye from somewhere to his left, and then very deliberately looked away. He finished the punch and got another cup and drank that too. When the song ended, Garrett said something that made Evelyn smile, and she said something back, and they stepped off the floor together, and Garrett's hand was at the small of her back, in the casual way of a man who was comfortable with the gesture. Wyatt set his cup down on the nearest table and went outside. He stood on the porch in the warm night air and looked at the street and listened to the fiddle starting up again inside and thought several unproductive thoughts in sequence. The door opened behind him, and he knew without turning who it was. "You leaving already?" Evelyn said. "Getting some air." She came to stand beside him at the porch rail. Not too close, just beside. "You don't come to these often," she said. "No." "Dale said you were here about the irrigation thing." "Partly." A pause. The fiddle inside was playing something slower now. "Paul Garrett asked if he could call on me," she said. It was said evenly, without particular emphasis, the way she said most things that she knew were going to land in the air between them with weight. Wyatt looked at the street. "He seems like a good man," he said. "He is. He's easy to talk to." "That's good." Another pause. "I told him I'd think about it," she said. Something shifted in his chest. Not a good shift, the kind that came from the direction of something you'd been not looking at for long enough that when you finally looked, it was bigger than you expected. "That's sensible," he said. He heard how it sounded. He was aware it was wrong. Evelyn turned and looked at him, and in the lantern light coming through the window, he could see her face clearly enough to read it, and what he read was not quite what he'd expected. Not anger, not even impatience. Something more tired than that. The expression of a person who has been waiting a long time and is beginning to wonder if the waiting is its own answer. "Wyatt," she said. "Evelyn, is there anything you want to say to me?" The fiddle played. The creak made its sound from somewhere in the dark. He could hear the murmur of voices inside and the occasional burst of laughter. He had things he wanted to say. He was aware of this. They were not complicated things, in their raw form. They were, in fact, among the simplest and most ordinary things one person could say to another. But they required the dissolution of something he'd been building for 6 years, brick by deliberate brick. And he was standing here on the porch of the Grange Hall and not ready. "Not right now," he said. She nodded once, short. "All right," she said, and she went back inside. He stood on the porch for another few minutes, and then he went back inside too. And he talked to Dale about the irrigation channel and ate another piece of pie and left at 9 o'clock and drove home in the dark and sat on his own porch with Gus for a while before he went to bed. He didn't sleep well. September arrived without rain, which meant the drought was setting records now, the longest dry stretch the valley had seen in at least 20 years, possibly more. The creek was low enough that the crossing was knee-deep in places rather than ankle-deep, and the water had a different quality, slower and warmer. The pastures were brown. The cattle were thin. Wyatt was not doing significantly worse than most of his neighbors, which was to say he was doing poorly enough that the arithmetic required constant attention. He'd cut the herd down further, sold another 12 head at prices he didn't love, and had taken on a small job helping with fencing on the Ridley spread to bring in some extra cash, which meant he was working 7 days a week and coming home too tired to think, which at least solved one problem even as it created others. He went to the committee meeting about the irrigation channel. He said what he had to say about the creek levels and the downstream effects, carefully and without dramatics, and the committee noted his comments and thanked him and continued their discussion in the direction it was already going, which was toward Frank Ridley's preferred outcome. But Evelyn's name got mentioned, and the Hart property's dependence on the creek, and Wyatt made sure it was on the record. He saw Evelyn at the feed store in early September, briefly, while she was picking up a small order for her parents. They talked for 5 minutes about the drought and the committee and her father's health, which was not improving. She looked tired, not in a broken way, but in the way of someone who was carrying more than was comfortable and had been for a while. "You need anything out at the property?" he asked. It was a neutral question, practical. "We're managing," she said. He heard the echo of his own answer to her question at the town hall, and thought she might have heard it too because something flickered across her face that was brief and complicated. "The creek crossing's getting tricky for the wagon," she said. "The north ford's down to nothing." "I can grade the south crossing," he said. "Clear some of the silting, if it would help." "It would help," she said. "Thank you." He went out on a Saturday and spent the morning at the creek with a shovel, clearing the silt that had built up at the south ford, and resetting the flat stones that made the crossing easier for a loaded wagon. It was not difficult work, just thorough, requiring patience more than strength. Evelyn came down to the bank while he was midway through and brought him a cup of water without making anything of it, and they talked while he worked, about the drought, about her father's hands, about the Calloway wedding, which had apparently been a significant occasion, about a family named Brewer who'd arrived from Kansas and taken up the vacant land east of Ridley's, and whom nobody in the valley had quite taken the measure of yet. "Did you know them in Kansas?" she asked. "I don't know anyone from Kansas," he said. "I just wondered, the way you mentioned them at the committee meeting." He hadn't mentioned them at the committee meeting. He'd mentioned the Brewer family's water rights as a complicating factor in the irrigation discussion. It was not the same as knowing them. "Just keeping track of who holds what claims," he said. She watched him for a moment. "You keep track of a lot of things." "It's useful." "It is," she said. "Sometimes it's also a way of staying busy so you don't have to decide anything." He looked up from the ford. She was watching him steadily with the particular expression she'd had on the Grange Hall porch. Not angry, not impatient, something more honest than either of those. "Evelyn?" he started. "You don't have to," she said. "Not right now, I'm just saying." She took the cup back and went up the bank to the garden, and he finished the ford and washed his hands in the creek and stood there looking at the water for a long moment before he got in the truck and drove home. The letter arrived for Evelyn on a Thursday in the second week of September. Wyatt didn't know about the letter when it came. He found out the way you found out most things in a small valley, through the ambient flow of information that moved between people who'd lived in the same place long enough that most news reached them eventually, whether or not they'd asked for it. He heard it from Dale Sutton, who'd heard it from Clara, who'd heard it from Margaret Hart herself at the dry goods store. A letter from a woman named Rose Arden, who ran a bakery and kitchen in Portland. She'd heard of Evelyn through a mutual connection, had been looking for a business partner to help her expand, and had written to propose that Evelyn come to Portland to discuss terms. Portland was 300 miles away. The proposition was serious, apparently. Rose Arden's operation was established and profitable, and she was offering real partnership terms, not just a job. It would mean leaving the valley. Wyatt heard this on a Wednesday afternoon outside the feed store, and processed it with the external calm that he applied to most information and the internal state of a man who had just understood something about time that he'd been refusing to understand. He drove home. He fed the cattle. He ate supper without tasting it. He sat on the porch in the dark with Gus until the dog fell asleep, and then he sat alone. He thought about Evelyn Hart, who had been 27 years old for 3 months now, and who ran a successful small business and took care of her parents and fixed her own fences when she had to, and went to town meetings and made good bread and laughed with her whole face, and had been living 50 yards away across a creek for 6 years, while he looked at the creek from the other bank and told himself it wasn't the right time. He thought about Paul Garrett and George Albrecht and Marcus Calloway, none of whom were sitting on their own porches doing nothing. He thought about the expression on her face when she asked him if there was anything he wanted to say to her, and the flat quality of her all right when he said no. He thought about his mother's kitchen and his father going quiet, and the way the ranch felt at 9 o'clock at night when Gus was asleep and there was nothing but the sound of the wind. He thought about Portland, which was 300 miles away, and how a letter was not yet a decision, but was the kind of thing that moved toward one. He sat on the porch until the night was deep and the stars were out in full, the sky doing its September thing where it turned sharp and bright and improbably beautiful over the valley. He could see the light in the Hart house from where he sat, a single window upstairs, which would be Evelyn's room. She was probably reading. She usually read in the evenings if she had the time. He knew this the way you knew things about a person when you'd been paying attention for long enough without admitting you were paying attention. The light went out sometime after 10. He went inside. He lay in his own bed in the dark and stared at the ceiling and made no decisions that night. But something had shifted in the arithmetic. A variable had changed, and the equation was coming out different than it had before, and he was going to have to do something about it. He just didn't know yet if he was brave enough to do what the math required. The next morning, he got up before the light and fed the cattle and drove the fence post he'd been meaning to do all week, and came back to the house and sat at the kitchen table with his second cup of coffee and looked at the empty chair across from him for a long time. Then he got up, washed his face, put on a clean shirt, and walked across the creek. He hadn't thought about what he was going to say. That was the honest truth of it. He'd walked across the creek in his clean shirt with his coffee still sitting warm on the kitchen table, and he'd arrived at the Hart front door with nothing prepared, which was probably the most reckless thing Wyatt Mercer had done in 6 years. He knocked. Margaret answered. She looked at him, looked at the clean shirt, and something moved across her face that she controlled before it became an expression. "Wyatt," she said. "Morning, Mrs. Hart. Is Evelyn around?" "She's in the garden." A pause. "The east side?" "With the squash." "Thank you." He went around the side of the house. Evelyn was crouched between 2 rows of winter squash, working a stubborn weed out of the base of a plant with the focused attention she gave to things that required patience. Her back was to him. She didn't hear him come around the corner. "Evelyn," he said. She turned. She looked at him for a moment, then at the general fact of him standing there at 8:15 in the morning in a clean shirt, when she knew for a fact he had work to do on his own property. "Wyatt." Not a question. Not surprised exactly. More like a person who had guessed at something and was now finding out if they'd guessed right. "I heard about the letter," he said. "From Portland." She sat back on her heels. Didn't say anything yet. "I know it's none of my business," he said. "The letter isn't mine. What you decide to do isn't mine. I know that." He stopped, tried to locate the actual point he'd walked across the creek to make. "But I've been sitting across that water for a long time and not saying what I should say, and I'm done doing that." Evelyn looked at the squash plant in her hand. She set it down carefully on the soil. "Go ahead then," she said. And so he did. Not eloquently, he wasn't built for eloquent, but honestly, in the way of a man who'd run out of the capacity to be strategic about something and was left with only the plain version. He told her he'd been watching her for a long time, longer than he'd admitted to himself. He told her about the Thursday morning coffee and the town hall porch and the Grange Hall dance, and how he'd stood outside on that porch and said, "Not right now," and gone home, and told himself he'd made the right call, and how that had been a lie he'd gotten pretty good at telling. He told her he was not an easy man. He knew that. The ranch knew it. The fence line knew it. And that he had more habits of solitude than was probably useful for anyone who got close to him. He told her he didn't have a polished speech or a plan beyond walking across the creek this morning. and saying the thing out loud so that it couldn't be unsaid. He said, "I don't want you to go to Portland." He said, "I mean, not because of the letter, not because of Rose Arden or the business. If that's what you want, that's what you should do. But I want you to know, before you decide, that I've been an idiot about this for years, and I'm telling you that now, and if there's any chance you'd be willing to—" He ran out of words. Evelyn had been looking at him through all of it with an expression that was difficult to read, which was its own kind of information. She was not smiling. She was not cold. She had the focused quality she brought to things that required her full attention. "If I'd be willing to what?" she said. "To let me do better," he said. "By you. If you wanted that." A long moment. The morning was warming up around them, the light coming in at an angle through the cottonwoods, and a rooster from somewhere down the road was making its usual complaints about the hour. "Do you know how many times I've had that conversation in my head?" she said. Her voice was even. "The one where you say something real. I've had it probably 60 times. More, maybe." She looked at him steadily. "And every time I had it in my head, you showed up at the right moment and said the right thing." "I know," he said. "I didn't." "No," she said. "You didn't." A pause. "But you're here now." He waited. "I haven't decided about Portland," she said. "I haven't even written back to Rose Arden yet. It arrived 4 days ago, and I've been thinking." She brushed the dirt from her hands against her apron, a practical gesture, the same way she approached everything. "But I'm not going to make that decision without knowing what I'm deciding against. You understand?" "I understand. So here's what I'm going to say." She stood up, and she was looking at him directly now, in the way she had that made it impossible to pretend you were somewhere else. "I've had feelings for you since I was probably 23 years old, Wyatt. I'm not going to apologize for that, or dress it up as something more sophisticated than it is. It's been a fact of my life that I've managed around for several years because you were clearly not in a position to do anything about it." A breath. "And if you're standing here telling me you're in a position now, then I believe you. But I need to know what that actually means, not in a general way. What does it mean?" He thought about what he wanted to say, what he actually meant. "It means I want to come over for coffee on Thursday mornings and not have it be a neutral thing," he said. "It means when something goes wrong on the ranch, you're the first person I want to talk to. It means—" He stopped. "It means I've been lonely for 6 years and I'm tired of it, and you're the only person I've sat in a room with and not felt lonely." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You should probably talk to my father." Clarence Hart received the conversation with the equanimity of a man who had seen it coming and had been waiting on it with the particular patience of someone who has accepted that certain things happen when they happen and not a day before. He was at the kitchen table with his newspaper as usual. He listened to Wyatt's careful explanation of his intentions, which was not a formal request for permission, both of them being too old for that, but a statement of respect and honesty. And then he folded his newspaper in half and set it down and said, "Took you long enough." "I know," Wyatt said. "Evelyn's got a good head," Clarence said. "Better than most. She's been managing half this property for 2 years now, and she hasn't complained once." He looked at Wyatt with the direct assessment of a man who has thought about this moment for a while. "You treating her well isn't optional. You understand that?" "I do." "Then I don't have any objections." He picked up his newspaper again. "Margaret will want to know." Margaret already knew. She was in the doorway to the back kitchen, pretending to find something in a cupboard, and when Wyatt looked in her direction, she simply nodded once, the nod of a woman whose opinion had long been formed on this subject and who was relieved to have it validated. The courtship, if that was even the right word for two people who'd been neighbors for years and were now simply being honest about it, was not dramatic in the way of stories people told later. It was quiet, and it was real, and it had the particular awkwardness of two adults who knew each other well in some ways and were discovering each other in others. He came to supper on Friday evenings. She came to look over the ranch accounts with him on Sunday afternoons because she was better with numbers than he was and had told him so directly the first time he'd spread the ledgers on the table and she'd seen the state of them. They went to the committee meeting together, the third one about the irrigation channel, and she said 3 sentences at the appropriate moment that landed better than his prepared remarks had, which he told her afterward, and she said, "You set it up, I just closed it," which was generous and also accurate. In the evenings after supper at the Hart House, they sat on the porch sometimes, and the conversations went longer and further than they'd gone before. Not because they were different people, they were exactly the same people, but because the filter was gone, the careful management of what got said and what didn't. She talked about the bakery with the real complexity of it, the parts she loved, and the parts that wore on her. The early mornings, the accounts that didn't balance the way she'd planned them, the customer who paid late every single month and whom she couldn't drop because he was also the man who supplied her flour. She talked about Portland honestly, what the letter had meant to her, the small startled feeling she'd had reading it, the realization that she'd stopped imagining other futures for herself somewhere along the last few years without noticing. Was it a real consideration? He asked her on the second Friday evening. Seriously, not just possibility. She thought about it. Yes and no, she said. It was real in the way that it reminded me that I had options, that the valley isn't the only place I could build something. She looked at him. That mattered more than the specific offer. I understand that, he said. I know you do, she said. That's part of it. He didn't ask her to write back to Rose Arden and decline. She did it on her own, in her own time, about 2 weeks after the morning in the garden, and she told him about it matter-of-factly and without drama, the way she announced most decisions she'd already thought through. Did you want to tell me before you sent it? He asked. I knew what I was deciding, she said. I didn't need to talk it through. That was Evelyn. He was learning the shape of it, the way she processed things internally and arrived at decisions with a firmness that was not stubbornness, but confidence in her own thinking. He was not entirely like that. He tended to chew on things longer than was useful, to circle a problem until he'd worn a path around it. They were not the same, which he was beginning to understand was not a problem. It was just accurate. October arrived, and with it, finally, rain. Not the gentle start of a wet season, but a proper hard rain that lasted 3 days and left the creek running higher and the pastures beginning to green at the edges and the general mood of the valley lifting perceptibly. Men who'd been carrying tight expressions for 2 months started speaking in full sentences again. The feed store had more traffic. The saloon at Hennessy's was loud on a Wednesday night, which was not its usual night. The rain also did what heavy rain does after a long drought. It exposed everything the dry summer had damaged. Fence lines that had been holding by habit gave out. A section of Wyatt's barn roof that had needed attention since spring became urgent when water started coming through it. He spent 3 days on repairs, working from early until he lost the light, and on the second evening Evelyn arrived with food and without announcement, and ate supper with him at the rough table in the barn because he hadn't bothered to go to the house, and they talked while the rain came down on the patched roof, and Gus lay under the table with his head on her boot. You need more help out here, she said. It was not an accusation, it was an observation made by a person looking at a workload. I've been managing it alone for a while, he said. I know you have. She looked at the barn roof, the patched section, the older parts that would need attention soon. That doesn't mean it's the right size for one person. I'll hire on for the big jobs, he said. Branding, the fall roundup. I'm not talking about branding. She looked at him. I'm talking about the daily math of it. It's not sustainable the way you've been doing it. He didn't argue because she was right. The truth was the ranch had been sized for his father and mother, and eventually for children who hadn't come into the picture before everything changed, and running it as a single man meant accepting a constant state of triage, doing the urgent things and letting the important but not urgent things accumulate until they became urgent too. I know, he said. There are options, she said. You could scale back, or you could take on a partner, or... She paused. Not dramatically, just the natural pause of a person choosing their words. Or the situation changes. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the patient expression, the one that didn't push but didn't pretend not to mean what it meant. Evelyn, he said. I'm not putting a timeline on it, she said. I'm just saying the math is the math. A slight smile. Someone told me that recently. He laughed. It came out abruptly, not polished, the laugh of a man who doesn't laugh often enough, and it shows. Gus lifted his head from her boot and looked at him with canine suspicion. You're not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? He thought about it. I don't know. Something softer, maybe. You're always kind. To everyone, I thought that was all of it. She considered this. Kindness isn't the same as soft, she said. I'm kind because it costs me nothing and helps people. That's just practical. A pause. But I know what I want and I know what I think, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise to make someone comfortable. No, he said. You're not. Does that bother you? No, he said, and he meant it. It's the part I was least prepared for and the part I like most. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he was getting better at reading, not quite a smile, but something warmer than neutral. Finish your supper, she said. It's getting cold. Cha. November came in with the first bite of real cold, the kind that reminded everyone in the valley that winter out here was not a season to be casual about. The creek dropped back to normal levels after the October rains, and then some, and the cattle were on the winter pasture rotation now, and Wyatt was into the quieter rhythms of the cold season, checking water troughs, managing the hay stores, the endless small maintenance that kept a ranch functional through the months when everything was trying to freeze. He was in a better position than he'd been in October. The fall cattle prices had been reasonable. The rain had relieved the drought debt that everyone in the valley had been carrying, and the ranch was holding. It wasn't prospering, not exactly, but it was holding. Frank Ridley's operation was a different story. The full scale of Ridley's trouble became clear in November, when news moved through the valley that he'd taken out 2 loans in the fall, one from the county bank and one from a private lender named Barrett, who was associated with a land company based in Sacramento, against the value of his north pastures. The drought had cost him more than he'd let on publicly. He'd sold cattle at bad prices in August to cover immediate debts, and was now carrying paper against land that was only worth what it was worth if his operation continued to function. The Barrett loan had a short term, 14 months, and the interest rate, when Dale Sutton mentioned what he'd heard, made Wyatt set down his coffee cup. That's not a loan, Wyatt said. That's a trap. That's what I said, Dale agreed. They were at Wyatt's kitchen table on a Sunday morning. Evelyn was there too. She'd started coming to these informal Sunday conversations, partly because Wyatt wanted her there, and partly because she had a clearer eye for certain kinds of financial logic than either of them. Who's Barrett? She said. Works with a Sacramento land company, Dale said. I've heard the name twice in the last year, both times in connection with properties that changed hands under pressure. A silence settled over the table. Frank knows what he signed, Wyatt said. Frank's desperate, Dale said. Desperate men don't read the fine print. What happens if he can't cover the note? Evelyn asked. Barrett takes the north pastures, Dale said, or the whole property if the terms are as bad as I'm told. He looked at Wyatt. And if Barrett's connected to who I think he's connected to, he doesn't want the land for ranching. What does he want it for? Evelyn said. There's a railroad survey, Wyatt said slowly. He'd heard something about this, a rumor, mostly, from the surveyor's work that Paul Garrett had been involved with over the summer. He hadn't connected it to Ridley until right now. Eastern route. They're looking at options for the branch line. A longer silence. Ridley's north pastures sit right where that route would need to come through, Dale said. So if Barrett gets the land cheap through a distressed debt, Evelyn said, thinking out loud, he flips it to the railroad at 3 times the value. That's how it works, Dale said. Wyatt sat with this for a moment. He didn't like Frank Ridley particularly. The man was loud and self-serving and had spent the summer using his size to leverage public resources toward his private benefit. But what Dale was describing wasn't a man getting what he deserved for bad decisions. It was a man getting taken apart by people who designed the situation to produce exactly that outcome. Does Frank know any of this? He asked. I don't know what Frank knows, Dale said. Someone should talk to him, Evelyn said. Both men looked at her. I know he's not easy, but if he's about to lose his land to people who specifically engineered it, someone should tell him. She looked at Wyatt. You have the clearest picture of it. Frank and I aren't close, Wyatt said. You don't have to be close, she said. You just have to be honest with him. You're good at that when you decide to do it. That last part landed quietly, and he heard it. He went to see Ridley on a Tuesday afternoon. It was not a comfortable visit. Frank Ridley was not a man who received information gracefully, particularly information that implied he'd been maneuvered, and he went through several stages of response: dismissal, irritation, a loud insistence that he knew what he'd signed and had it managed, before something in his face shifted and he asked Wyatt to go through the railroad connection again. Wyatt went through it again. Ridley sat in his big chair by the window of his ranch house and looked at nothing for a long time. "If that's true," he said finally. "I don't know that it's true," Wyatt said carefully. "I know the pieces fit. Who else knows?" "Dale Sutton, Evelyn Hart, a few others probably by now." He paused. "It's the kind of thing that moves through the valley." Ridley's jaw tightened. He was not a man who liked knowing that his difficulties had been the subject of other people's kitchen table conversations, which was understandable, but also beside the point. "What do you want me to do with it?" Ridley said. It came out rough. "Get a lawyer to look at the Barrett note," Wyatt said. "A real one, not whoever Barrett recommended. Someone from outside the county, if you can." He stood up. "And if you find what I think you'll find, you've got options. Refinancing, extension through the county bank. They'd rather work with you than watch Barrett take the land. But you've got to move before that 14 months runs out." He left Ridley sitting by his window. He didn't know if the man would listen. People who'd built their self-image around being the biggest operator in the valley didn't easily accept being rescued, even from themselves. But Wyatt had said the true thing. What Ridley did with it was his own. On the way back through town, he stopped at the bakery. It was late afternoon, the last hour before Evelyn closed up, and the shop was empty of customers. She was wrapping the remaining bread for the day's donations. She gave the unsold bread to 2 families in town who she knew needed it, quietly, without announcement. "How'd it go?" she said, without looking up. "He heard it," Wyatt said. "Whether he acts on it is another thing." "You did what you could do." "Feels like not enough." She tied the last package and stacked it with the others. Then she looked at him. "You went there and told a man you don't like an uncomfortable truth because it was the right thing to do. That's not nothing." She came around the counter and took her apron off. "You want to walk home by the creek road? It's clear tonight." He did. They walked home in the cooling evening, the creek beside them running at a level that meant health. The cottonwoods bare now, their branches against the sky. They didn't talk much. The comfortable quiet that was different from the careful quiet of before, easier in its bones. At the point where the road bent and the 2 properties came close together at the crossing, they stopped. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told her. "In the barn. About the math." She waited. "I was going to ask you if—" He stopped. He was not doing this wrong again. "I'm asking you to marry me, Evelyn. Not because of the math, and not because of Portland, and not because of any reason except that I'm a better version of myself when you're in the room, and I'd like to make a life with you if you'll have me." The creek moved past them in the early dark. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You said that without a single word I'd have to cut out. I had time to think on the ride back from Ridley's." "I can tell." She looked at him. "Yes, I'll marry you." He reached for her hand and she let him take it, and they stood there at the creek crossing in the November cold for a while before they walked the rest of the way home. Not to separate houses this time. They stood together on the Hart porch and told Margaret, who already knew in the way she knew most things, and she said simply, "It's about time," and went to put the kettle on. Clarence, from his chair in the sitting room, said, "Knew it since the fence post in June." Evelyn laughed. The real one, the full-face one, and Wyatt felt something in his chest open up that he hadn't known was closed. Later, walking back across the creek to his own house in the dark, Gus at his heels, Wyatt looked at the Hart house and the lit windows and thought about the word home and what it had meant before and what it meant now. Not the same thing. The difference was not small. He went inside and sat at the kitchen table where the coffee cup from that morning was still there, long cold, and he didn't clean it up right away. He just sat with it for a minute, in the house that was about to become something different, and let the quiet feel like what it was. Not emptiness, for once, but the space before something begins. They were married on a Saturday in the first week of December, at the county clerk's office in town, with Margaret and Clarence Hart and Dale and Clara Sutton as witnesses. It was not a large occasion. Evelyn had said she didn't want a production of it. They were both past the age where a big public ceremony felt like the point. And Wyatt had agreed without difficulty, because the idea of standing in front of the whole valley while people made faces at him was not one he'd been enthusiastic about. What she had wanted was her mother's ring, which was a plain gold band that Margaret had worn for 34 years, and which she took off her own finger the evening before without ceremony and pressed into Evelyn's palm and said, "It held. It'll hold for you too." And her father's presents, which Clarence provided by getting himself dressed properly on a cold Saturday morning when his hands were hurting and his back was bad, and not saying a word about either. What Wyatt had wanted, though he hadn't articulated it, was for it to feel real. He'd been afraid somehow that standing in a clerk's office with two witnesses and no ceremony to speak of would feel thin, like a transaction rather than a fact. It didn't. When the clerk asked them to say what needed to be said, and they said it, looking at each other in the small wood-paneled room with the winter light coming through the single window, it felt like the most solid thing he'd done in years. More solid than the fence posts, more solid than the cattle sales and the mortgage payments and all the practical architecture of a life maintained alone. This had weight to it, real weight. Afterward, they ate a late lunch at the hotel dining room, all six of them, Clarence eating carefully around his difficult hands, and Margaret cutting his food without being asked and without making anything of it. And Dale gave a toast that was short and accurate and made Evelyn laugh, and Clara hugged them both. And by 3 o'clock in the afternoon it was done, and they were driving home together in Wyatt's truck through the cold December light. "How do you feel?" Evelyn asked, not long after they cleared the edge of town. "Different," he said. "Better different." "Good." She was looking out the window at the valley rolling past, the brown winter grass, the far ridgelines. "I feel settled," she said. "I don't know if that's what I expected to feel, but it's what I feel." "Settled's good," he said. "For me it is," she said. "I've been unsettled for years without knowing it was that." He understood what she meant. The unsettled quality of a life that was working fine, but was missing something you'd learned not to name. Baktır. The first months of their married life had the particular texture of two people learning to share space who already knew each other and discovered in the living of it that knowing someone and living alongside them were different educations. Evelyn moved into the ranch house in December. She brought what was hers, her clothes, her books, her kitchen things, which were considerably better organized than his, and she did it methodically over the course of a week, making decisions about what went where with a quiet efficiency that Wyatt found he didn't mind nearly as much as he might have expected. His house had been a bachelor's house for 6 years, functional, sparse, organized around the logic of a single person who needed to find things in the dark. She didn't disrupt the logic of it. She added to it. A shelf of books in the sitting room that hadn't had books before, a particular order to the kitchen that made more sense than his, 2 chairs on the porch instead of 1. The ranch house itself needed work that became obvious once a second person was living in it full time. The second bedroom, which had been his parents' room and which he'd used for storage since his mother died, needed to be cleared and dealt with. The roof over the back kitchen needed the same attention the barn roof had gotten in October. The cellar stairs were loose in a way that was manageable for one careful adult and would become a problem for anyone carrying something. They worked on it together, in the evenings and on Sundays, fitting the repairs around the bakery schedule and the ranch schedule. She kept the bakery running. There was never a question about that. It was her business and her income, and part of what made the whole operation financially coherent. And she got up at 4 in the morning, 6 days a week to start the day's bread, which meant Wyatt was also up at 4, which was not a hardship since he'd been getting up at 5 anyway. He drove her to the bakery in the cold dark and picked her up in the afternoons, or she rode herself when the weather was manageable. They were not always easy with each other. That was the truth of it, and Wyatt had lived long enough to understand that the absence of ease was not the same as the absence of rightness. He had habits of withdrawal. When something bothered him, he went quiet in a way that was not intentional, but was also not nothing, a closing of doors that he'd developed over years of being alone, and that he was only partially conscious of. Evelyn noticed it immediately and said so, directly, the first time it happened in a way she felt warranted naming. It was over something small, a decision he'd made about the hay storage without consulting her, which affected the cellar space she'd been planning to reorganize. He'd done it because it was a ranch decision, and he was used to making ranch decisions alone, not because he didn't value her opinion. She knew that. She said it anyway. "You don't have to run things by me for permission," she said. "I'm not your employer. But when your decision affects shared space, I'd like to know before I find out by walking into the cellar." "You're right," he said. "I didn't think." "I know you didn't," she said. "That's what I'm saying." He'd expected more of it, more friction, more negotiation. What he got instead was Evelyn's particular brand of directness, which was not combative, but was also not going to let things slide because sliding was easier. She said what she meant when it mattered. He learned, gradually and imperfectly, to do the same. The going quiet still happened, but the duration got shorter, and she learned when to wait it out and when to walk into it. And he learned that being waited on was not the same as being abandoned. Gus decided within approximately 2 days that Evelyn was his primary person and transferred his full devotion accordingly, which Wyatt found only mildly offensive. The Ridley situation moved through the winter slowly, and then, in February, all at once, Frank Ridley had taken Wyatt's advice, more slowly than was advisable, but he'd taken it. He'd gotten a lawyer, a man from the county seat named Howard Pruitt, who came with a solid reputation and a lack of connection to anyone in Barrett's network. Pruitt had looked at the Barrett loan document and confirmed what Wyatt had suspected. The terms included a clause that allowed Barrett to call the note early under conditions that were written vaguely enough to apply at almost any time, which was not an accident. Pruitt had also, with some digging, found that the land company Barrett represented had registered interest in the railroad survey corridor 6 months before Ridley's loan was issued. The sequence had a shape to it that was not ambiguous. This information, when it moved through the valley, landed differently for different people. For the smaller ranchers and farmers who'd always existed in Frank Ridley's shadow, there was something that wasn't quite satisfaction. It was too serious for that, but was also not uncomplicated sympathy. Ridley had been difficult and loud and had used his size as leverage for years. Nobody had planned for his downfall, but not everyone was heartbroken about the vulnerability of it either. This was human and not admirable, and most people knew it, which meant they felt guilty about it, which meant they expressed sympathy more loudly than they might have otherwise. For Wyatt, the situation had become something he was more involved in than he'd intended. Ridley had come to him twice in January, ostensibly to update him on the lawyer situation. Actually, Wyatt suspected, because the man needed someone to talk to who wasn't going to either judge him or use the information against him. These were not conversations he would have chosen, but he sat through them and said what was useful and didn't pretend the situation was better than it was. Evelyn was the one who suggested what eventually became the practical solution. At the kitchen table on a Sunday in February, when she and Wyatt and Dale were talking through what Pruitt had found. "The issue is that Barrett can call the note," she said, "so Frank needs to eliminate the note, which means refinancing, which means the county bank needs to want to work with him." "The county bank has no reason to want to," Dale said. "They've seen his books." "They have every reason to want to," she said. "If Barrett's company gets that land and flips it to the railroad, the county loses the tax base. The bank loses a long-time account. The whole North Range changes hands to outside interests." She looked at Dale. "That's an argument you can make to the bank manager, in practical terms. Not as a favor to Frank, as a matter of what's good for the bank and the county." Dale looked at her for a moment, then at Wyatt. "She's right. I know she's right," Wyatt said. "Will Frank accept it?" Dale said. "It means going to the bank with his hat in his hand." "Frank will accept anything that keeps his land," Wyatt said. "He's past pride on this." Evelyn drafted the argument, in writing, precise and unsentimental, 2 pages laying out the economic logic for the bank's cooperation, and Pruitt took it to the county bank manager along with the documentation of Barrett's premeditated position in the railroad survey. The bank manager, a methodical man named Cole, who had a banker's dislike for outside interests manipulating local assets, read the 2 pages and then called a meeting. The meeting took 3 hours. Wyatt was there, which he hadn't expected to be necessary, but which Pruitt had asked for, because Cole trusted Wyatt in the way that people in the valley trusted him. Not because he was charming or important, but because he was known to tell the truth at inconvenient moments, and not for his own benefit. Ridley was there, looking 10 years older than he'd looked in August, sitting with the careful stillness of a man trying not to betray how frightened he was. Cole refinanced the note at terms that were difficult but survivable. Barrett's loan was retired. The land stayed. It was not a triumphant outcome. Frank Ridley left that meeting with a 5-year repayment schedule he was going to feel every single month, and a ranch operation he'd have to run leaner than he ever had. He was not the man he'd been in July, the loud, confident, loudest voice in the room figure who'd used every public forum to leverage his own interests. That version of Frank Ridley had been burned through by 6 months of genuine fear, and what was left was something more ordinary and more honest. In the street outside the bank, after Cole had gone back in and Pruitt had gone to collect his papers, Ridley looked at Wyatt and said, "I know what you did. I didn't do much, Wyatt said. Don't do that, Ridley said, not unkindly. Your wife wrote those 2 pages. You sat in that room. Dale Sutton vouched for the argument. He was quiet for a moment. Why? I haven't been... He stopped. I haven't been particularly decent to you over the years. Wyatt considered the honest answer. Because Barrett doing what he was trying to do is bad for everyone in this valley, he said. And because it was the right thing. Ridley nodded once. He didn't say thank you, not in words, but the nod had something in it, and Wyatt accepted it. Spring came late and damp, which was preferable to another drought and not without its own problems. The low pastures were slow to drain, the creek ran high through March, and Wyatt spent 2 weeks in April rerouting the runoff channel on the east side of the property so it didn't undermine the fence line he'd rebuilt the previous fall. He and Evelyn had their first serious argument in March. Not a disagreement or a tension, but an actual argument, with raised voices and a door that got closed harder than necessary, and an evening spent on opposite sides of the house. It was about Clarence. Evelyn's father had been declining in ways that had been gradual enough to overlook until they weren't. His hands were worse. His movement was slower. In February, he'd had 2 episodes of what Margaret called confusion, brief but concerning, where he'd become uncertain about where he was or what day it was. The family doctor had been out and had used careful language that meant what it meant. Evelyn had been managing this. The additional time at her parents' house, the more frequent check-ins, the coordination with Margaret on what was needed, without saying much about it to Wyatt beyond the facts. She was capable at management. She was not always willing to ask for what she needed. The argument started because Wyatt had noticed and had addressed it incorrectly. He'd suggested, practically and with genuine intention of being helpful, that they look into what arrangements might be needed for Clarence in the coming months, whether that meant more regular help from town, whether Margaret could manage, what the timeline looked like. I know what the timeline looks like, Evelyn said. Her voice had gone flat in a way he'd learned to recognize as warning. I'm not saying you don't. I'm saying we should plan for... I am planning for it. She put down what she was holding. I have been thinking about nothing else for 3 months, Wyatt. I don't need you to lay it out as a problem to be solved. That's not what I was doing. That's exactly what you were doing. You were doing the thing where you get the ledger out and start calculating. Her voice had an edge in it that he hadn't heard directed at him before. My father is not a ledger problem. I know that, he said, and it came out sharper than he meant. And from there it went sideways in the way that arguments go sideways when both people are right about their own position and neither is listening to the other's version. He went out to the barn. She stayed in the house. Gus, demonstrating the political acumen of a man who understood which side his bread was buttered on, stayed in the house with Evelyn. It was 2 hours before he came back in. She was in the kitchen with a cup of tea she'd clearly been working on for a while, and she looked at him when he came through the door and waited. I wasn't trying to reduce your father to an item on a list, he said. I was trying to say that I'm in this with you, and I don't know how to say that without it coming out like I'm running a meeting. She looked at him for a moment. I know that, she said. The edge was gone. I know that's what you meant. I'm tired. I've been tired for 3 months, and I don't know how to be tired out loud, so it came out at you instead. That's all right, he said. It's not, really, she said. But thank you. He sat down across from her. Tell me what you need, he said. Not the plan. What you actually need. She was quiet for a moment. This was hard for her, he'd learned. The asking, specifically, not the managing. She was proficient at both giving and managing, but asking required a kind of vulnerability she didn't default to. I need someone to check on them twice a week, she said. Not me. Someone who isn't carrying everything I'm carrying. To just go over and see that they're all right. A pause. And I need you to not make plans about it. Just do it. Twice a week, he said. I'll go Tuesdays and Fridays. She looked at her tea. Thank you, she said. And there was something in it that was more than the words. He went Tuesday and Friday from then on, all the way through that spring and into summer and beyond. He sat with Clarence for an hour each time, and Clarence was good some days and quieter others. And they talked about cattle and weather and the valley, and sometimes about nothing much, just sat in the same room, and that was sufficient. Margaret made him coffee every time, and he drank it, and she talked about what needed doing, and he helped with what he could. It was not dramatic, and it was not a solution. There was no solution, just a progression. But it was something he could do, and he did it.
Eso es que a veces.
The summer of 1890 brought new trouble in the form of the Brewer family. Cal Brewer had come from Kansas with his wife and 3 sons, and had taken up the land east of what had been Ridley's North Range, which was parceled land that had been sitting fallow for 2 years after a previous homesteader had given up and gone back to Missouri. The land was adequate, not prime, but workable, and the Brewers had worked it hard through their first winter. What became apparent by late spring was that Cal Brewer had a particular approach to property lines. He'd moved his fence west on the south end of his claim by approximately 40 feet, which put it onto a strip of grazing land that 3 smaller operations, including Wyatt's northeast corner, had been using under informal common agreement for years. It was not land any of them owned outright, but the usage had been established long enough that it carried practical weight. Brewer's position, when Dale Sutton rode over to discuss it neighborly and received a less than neighborly reception, was that he held title to what his deed said he held title to, and what other people had been doing with it previously was their problem to sort out. This was technically not wrong. That was the difficulty of it. Wyatt rode out to look at the fence line on a Tuesday in June and stood at the new post position and did the math. The strip in question was about 2 acres of decent grass along a drainage that stayed green longer than the surrounding range. Losing it wasn't catastrophic, but losing it without any response was the kind of thing that encouraged further movement. "He'll push again if we let this go," Dale said when they talked about it. "That's how this kind of man works. He tests, and if the test lands soft, he tests again." "We need to establish where the line actually is," Wyatt said, "legally, before the next push." "That means a survey," Dale said. "That costs money." "It costs less than the alternative." The survey was the straightforward part. What was less straightforward was that when the county surveyor came out and ran the measurements, he found that Brewer's fence was on the wrong side of the line, yes, but that the pre-existing common use of the strip didn't appear in any formal record and was therefore practically invisible to a legal proceeding. The informal arrangements that had governed that piece of ground for 15 years had never been written down because no one had imagined needing to write them down. Agreements between neighbors didn't require paper when the neighbors could be trusted. Cal Brewer was not the kind of neighbor who required paper because he intended to honor the agreement. He was the kind who required paper because without paper, there was no agreement. Wyatt brought the survey results home and laid them on the kitchen table, and Evelyn looked at them for a long time. "The usage needs to be documented," she said, "before he challenges it formally." "We need statements," Wyatt said, "from everyone who's used that strip, going back as far as we can get. That's 20 people, maybe more." She looked at him. "And some of them won't want to get involved." "I know." "Who starts it?" she said. "I do," he said. He spent 3 weeks on it. He rode to every operation that had used the drainage strip, sat at more kitchen tables than he could count, explained what he needed and why, and collected signed statements from 14 people documenting their use of the land across a span of years, going back to 1876. Some people cooperated immediately. Some needed convincing. 2 said flatly that they didn't want trouble with their new neighbor and declined, which Wyatt accepted without argument because he understood self-preservation even when it frustrated him. Evelyn organized the statements into a formal document, chronological, with a clear notation of the pattern of use that established something close to a prescriptive easement. She was systematic and thorough, and when Pruitt looked at it, he said it was better organized than most legal filings he received from trained professionals. They filed with the county court in August. Brewer countered with his deed and the argument that informal use did not constitute legal right. The proceeding took 4 months, longer than anyone wanted, with 2 hearings and more paper than the strip of land seemed worth. And in December, the county judge ruled that the documented pattern of use constituted a legitimate easement, and that Brewer's fence had to come back to the surveyed line. Brewer moved the fence. He didn't speak to anyone from the 3 operations for 6 months after, which was not a comfortable arrangement, but was manageable. He was still there, on his land, doing what he was doing. But he'd learned that the valley had a longer memory and more organizational capacity than he'd assumed, which was a lesson with consequences beyond the fence line. At the Suttons' kitchen table the evening the ruling came through, Dale poured whiskey for 3 of them and said, "We couldn't have done that without you 2. Wyatt said it had been a group effort. Evelyn said, The documentation held because the people held. That was the valley, not us. Clara Sutton looked between the two of them and said to Dale, "Do you see what I mean?" And Dale said he did, and declined to explain what he meant in front of the subjects of the observation, which made Evelyn laugh and Wyatt pretend he hadn't been curious. Clarence Hart died in October of 1890. He had been declining since spring, the good days becoming less frequent and the confused ones more, and then in September he had a hard week and didn't come back from it the way he'd come back before. And on the morning of October 14th, he simply stopped. He was in his own bed, in his own house, which was what everyone had wanted for him, and he didn't seem to suffer in the final weeks in the way that was sometimes feared. Wyatt had been there on the Friday before, a regular visit. Nothing he'd known would be the last. They'd sat in the sitting room and Clarence had been mostly quiet, but he'd looked at Wyatt at one point with the clear eyes of a good day, brief but real, and said, "You're a decent man. You took care of things." And then he'd looked out the window at the yard, and that was the end of the conversation. Wyatt thought about that sentence for a long time afterward. The funeral was small, family and close neighbors, a few people from town who had known Clarence since before the valley was what it was now. Evelyn held herself together with the particular composure of a person who is going to grieve privately and not in public, and Wyatt stood beside her through all of it and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. 3 days after the burial, he came home from the morning chores to find her at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the surface and her face doing something he hadn't seen it do before. Not crying, not broken, but opened up, the way a room looks when all the furniture that usually makes it functional has been cleared out. She was just sitting there with it. He sat down across from her. He didn't say it was going to be all right. He didn't say anything. He just sat. After a while, she said, "I used to go over there twice a day, for years. Even after I moved here, twice a day, most days." A pause. "I don't know what to do with the morning now. Come with me for the early check," he said. "If you want to." She looked up at him. "You hate company in the morning," she said. "I hate conversation in the morning," he said. "That's different. You can come without talking." Something shifted in her face. Not a smile, not quite. Something softer than her usual expression and more real for being softer. "All right," she said. She came the next morning and the one after, and it became a thing they did. The early round of the property in the first light, before the day demanded talking, before the world required them to be competent about anything. Just the two of them, and the cattle, and Gus, and the quality of air that only existed at that hour. Sometimes she talked, often she didn't. Both were fine. Margaret Hart had decided, after some weeks of discussion, that she would stay in the house on the Hart property rather than come to live with them at the ranch. She was 62 years old and clear-headed, and had kept that house for 30 years and did not intend to leave it for the sake of proximity. Evelyn had mixed feelings about this, which she worked through with the same internal processing she brought to difficult things and arrived at acceptance. Wyatt took on the maintenance of the Hart property with the same regularity he'd visited when Clarence was alive. By the end of 1890, the ranch was running differently than it had been 18 months before. 2 incomes, shared labor, decisions made at a kitchen table instead of alone in a truck. It was not a smooth operation. The fence still needed constant attention, the cattle still got into things they shouldn't, the weather still did what it did, but it was a working operation in a way that was sustainable in a way it hadn't been before. He stood at the barn door one evening in December, the sky going dark early the way it did in winter, the lights on in the house behind him, and he thought about the fence post he'd been driving in June of the previous year when he'd seen Evelyn across the creek fighting her garden fence, about how he'd watched her for a moment before calling over, about all the things that had depended on the decision to call over instead of looking away. He'd spent 6 years practicing the art of looking away from things that were going to require something from him. He hadn't fully stopped doing it, that was honest, but he'd gotten worse at it, which was probably the best he could hope for. The light in the kitchen window was Evelyn making supper. He could hear Gus barking at something in the east pasture, the distant sound of it carrying clean in the cold air. Somewhere down the creek road, a coyote answered a question nobody had asked. He went inside. He washed up. He sat at the table in his own kitchen, in his own house, which was not empty anymore, and it was not a small thing. He had no language for how not small it was, so he didn't try to find one. He just sat there and let it be what it was. The The winter of 1891 was the kind that made people in Redstone Valley talk about it for years afterward. Not in the romantic way that people sometimes talked about hard winters, not with any fondness or nostalgia, but in the flat, factual way of people who had been through something that tested the architecture of everything they'd built and found out which parts held and which didn't. It started in late November with a storm that came down from the north faster than anyone had predicted and dropped 14 inches of snow in 2 days. The creek froze solid for the first time in a decade. The cattle on the North Range came in from the pasture with ice in their coats and eyes that had the dull quality of animals pushed past comfortable cold into something more serious. Wyatt lost 2 head in the first week, not from the cold directly, but from the complications of it. One with a respiratory problem that had been minor before the storm and became critical after. One that had fallen in a drainage ditch obscured by snow and hadn't been found in time. 2 head was not a catastrophe. It was a cost. He absorbed it and kept moving. What the winter exposed that no amount of preparation had fully addressed was the structural condition of the older section of the barn, which had been standing since his father built it in 1872 and which had been repaired incrementally over the years rather than properly rebuilt. The southeast wall had a lean to it that was visible if you looked for it and forgettable if you didn't, and it had been on Wyatt's list of things to address in the spring for 2 years running. On the 3rd night of the cold snap, with the wind coming sideways and the temperature dropping to something that made the air feel different in the lungs, the southeast wall's lean became a collapse. He heard it from the house at 2 in the morning, not a crash exactly, more a prolonged settling sound followed by a single concussive thud, and was in his boots and coat before he was fully awake. Evelyn was right behind him. The wall had come down into the interior of the stall section, not outward, which meant the cattle that had been inside were penned in by debris but not crushed. That was luck, and he knew it, and he didn't examine it too closely because luck was not a thing you could depend on twice. He and Evelyn worked the next 3 hours in the cold and dark, moving debris by lantern light, getting the cattle out and into the secondary enclosure he used for calving, which was smaller than ideal but would hold them through the night. She didn't complain once. That wasn't remarkable. Evelyn didn't complain as a general practice. But at 2:30 in the morning in 14-degree cold, pulling broken timber off a pile of debris while the wind found every gap in her coat, it was something he noticed. "Get inside, Seth," he said at one point. "I can finish this." "You'll finish it faster with 2 people," she said, and kept working. By 5 in the morning, they had the cattle secured, the worst of the debris pulled clear, and a temporary barrier erected across the collapsed section to keep the wind from going straight through the building. They went inside and Evelyn made coffee while he sat at the kitchen table and added up the repair cost in his head and arrived at a number that made the rest of the winter feel heavier. "How bad?" she said, setting the cup in front of him. "The wall needs to come down entirely and be rebuilt," he said. "Not patched. Rebuilt. Which means the whole southeast section of the barn is going to be compromised until I can get to it. Which you can't do in this weather." "No." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "Which means the cattle are in the calving enclosure until it breaks. Which means I need to watch them more carefully because it's too crowded. Which means something else gets less attention." He looked at the arithmetic of it. Not the financial arithmetic this time, just the physical arithmetic of a one-man operation that was already running at capacity. "Spring's going to be a problem before it's a solution." Evelyn sat down across from him. She had that look she got when she was working through something. Not distant, just interior. "How much for the rebuild?" she said. He told her. She was quiet for a moment. "I have it," she said. He looked up. "In the bakery account," she said. "I've been building the reserve since before we were married. I was going to use it to expand the kitchen eventually, but that's not urgent." She looked at him steadily. "The barn is urgent." "That's your money," he said. "Your business money." "We have 1 set of books now," she said. "Or we should. We've been running them separately and it's made sense for now, but this—" She gestured toward the barn, toward the general situation outside. "This is a ranch decision and a household decision and a financial decision. We should be making it together from the same account." He thought about this. He'd been resistant, not consciously but in practice, to fully merging the finances. Partly because her bakery income was clearly hers, earned by her labor, built by her choices before he was part of any equation. Taking from it felt like taking something that wasn't his. It doesn't sit right with me, he said. I know it doesn't, she said. That's because you were raised to handle your own problems with your own resources, which is a good quality in a lot of contexts. A pause. But we are not two separate people managing adjacent problems anymore. We're one operation, and right now the operation needs the barn wall before it needs a bigger kitchen. He sat with it. I'll pay it back into the bakery account, he said, when the spring sales come through. You don't have to. I want to, he said. It matters to me. She looked at him for a moment, then she nodded. All right, she said, then that's how we'll do it. The barn wall got rebuilt in April, when the ground was soft enough and the weather reliable enough to work. He hired 2 men from town for the heavy framing work, which he'd not have done a year ago. Hired labor had always felt like an admission of insufficiency, which was a feeling he was getting better at recognizing as unproductive. The wall went up in 4 days and was more solid than anything that had been on that end of the barn since his father first raised it. And Wyatt paid the men and stood back and looked at it and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing properly fixed rather than managed around. He paid Evelyn back the barn money in 2 installments, the first from the spring cattle sale and the second from a contract he picked up in May hauling supplies for the brewer operation, which had been a surprise. Cal Brewer, without any fanfare and without ever explicitly acknowledging the fence dispute of the previous year, had come to Wyatt in March and said he needed a hauler for a regular supply run and had heard Wyatt's truck was reliable. Wyatt had said yes, because money was money, and because he was interested in whether the man had more in him than the fence dispute had suggested. He did, it turned out. Cal Brewer was not a warm man and was not going to become one, but he was a hard worker who had come from bad circumstances in Kansas and had developed a siege mentality about resources that read as aggression, but was, at its root, fear. This didn't excuse what he'd done with the fence line, and Wyatt didn't pretend it did, but it made the man legible in a way that made the working arrangement manageable. They were never friends, but by summer they could have a direct conversation about practical things without either of them needing to manage their face while doing it, which in Wyatt's estimation was about as much as the situation required. Evelyn was pregnant by March of 1891, which they knew before the barn wall was rebuilt, and which layered on top of everything else with a weight that was not unwelcome but was not light either. She told him on a Sunday morning with the directness she brought to everything, and he sat with it for a moment, not because he didn't want it, but because the fact of it was larger than any single feeling and required a moment to occupy properly. You all right? She said. Yes, he said. Are you? I don't know yet, she said. Ask me in a week. The pregnancy was not smooth. She had a difficult first 3 months, sick in the mornings with a persistence and violence that she found deeply inconvenient and said so, clearly, without drama but with a specificity about how much she resented the intrusion on her schedule that made him understand she was not performing tolerance. She was genuinely measuring the cost of it. She kept going to the bakery because the bakery needed her, and she managed the early hours by sheer discipline and the close proximity of a bucket, which she described with a frankness that he found he was glad for because it meant she wasn't protecting him from the reality of it. He took over the morning driving entirely, got up at 4 without being asked, started the fire in the bakery before she arrived, so she wouldn't have to stand over a cold stove feeling what she was feeling in the first light. He didn't make a thing of it. She didn't thank him in words, but she rested her hand on his arm one morning in the bakery doorway with a weight that meant more than a sentence would have. Margaret was at the house often through the spring. She and Evelyn had the particular relationship of a mother and daughter who were genuinely similar, both practical, both direct, both constitutionally disinclined to decorative emotion, which meant they could disagree sharply and not have it damage anything. Margaret had opinions about how the pregnancy should be managed, some of which were useful, and some of which were from a previous generation's understanding of things. And Evelyn sorted through them with a patience that impressed Wyatt, because he knew from living with her that patience with her mother was not her easiest virtue. She means well, he said one evening after Margaret had gone home. I know she means well, Evelyn said. That's not in question. She sat down carefully. She was 5 months along now, and her body was doing things she was adapting to with the incremental adjustment of someone who had not planned to find their physical self unreliable. I just wish meaning well translated more directly into listening. It doesn't, usually, he said. No, she said, it doesn't. A pause. You listen, she said. It came out simply, not as a compliment exactly, more as an observation about a fact she'd arrived at. "I try to," he said. "You do," she said. "You didn't used to, but you do now." He thought about that for a while after she went to bed, sitting at the kitchen table in the quiet that was his usual thinking hour. He didn't used to listen. He used to manage. He'd been expert at the logistics of other people's situations, at the practical resolution of stated problems, at showing up with the right tool and the right capability. Listening was different. Listening required a stillness he'd been uncomfortable with, a willingness to let someone else's reality be real in front of him without immediately processing it toward a solution. Evelyn had taught him that, not by instruction but by example, by being, herself, someone who listened before she fixed. He'd watched her do it at the bakery with a difficult customer, in the evenings with her mother, with Dale Sutton when the fence dispute had been at its most exhausting, and Dale needed to say the frustrating parts out loud before he was ready to talk strategy. She didn't rush any of it. She gave whatever amount of space the thing required, and then, when it was ready, she moved. He was getting better at it, slowly and imperfectly, with occasional backsliding into the efficiency mode that was his natural register, but better. Their daughter was born in August of 1891, on a Thursday evening, which Wyatt would always afterward think of as appropriate because Thursday had been the day everything started to change, and the days of the week had meant something particular to him ever since. They named her Clara, after Dale's wife, who had been a quiet, steady presence in their lives through all of it, the courtship, the marriage, the hard winter, the bakery accounts. Clara Sutton had said when she heard the name that she was honored, and also that she planned to take complete credit for anything good the child ever did, which was exactly what she would say. The birth was not easy. It was the kind of labor that made the doctor's face do things he was trying to keep it from doing, and it went long, nearly 18 hours, and Wyatt sat outside the room for most of it and was not good at it. He was not good at being on the outside of something he couldn't fix, at the specific helplessness of it. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped and said nothing to anyone and thought about nothing useful and felt the time moving through him like water. When the doctor came out and said they were both fine, he had to sit for a moment because his legs weren't entirely reliable. He went in. Evelyn was exhausted in a way that was different from any tired he'd seen in her. Deep down exhausted, the kind that runs all the way through a person. But she was there, looking at him with clear eyes, with Clara in the crook of her arm, and she said, "Come and look." He looked. He had no useful thought about it at the time. He just looked at his daughter, 7 pounds and determined about something even in the first hour of her life, her face doing the work of existing with the focused intensity of someone who had just arrived somewhere after a long journey and was figuring out the lay of the land. He put one finger in her hand and she gripped it with a certainty that had nothing learned about it, pure reflex, and he thought, there it is. Not eloquent, but there it was. Clara changed the ranch the way children change a place. Not all at once, but continuously. The same way a creek changes its banks, by the persistent fact of presence. She was not a quiet baby, which anyone who'd spent time with Evelyn's mother could have predicted, and the first 4 months were the kind of sleepless that reduces 2 competent adults to basic operational capacity and occasional poor judgment. They were not always graceful about it. He was short-tempered in ways that he wasn't proud of, particularly in the deep nights when Clara wouldn't settle, and he'd been up since 4 and the day ahead was not going to shorten to accommodate anyone's exhaustion. He said things sometimes that were true, but unkind. The things that come out when the filter wears thin. Evelyn, operating on the same insufficient sleep, said things back that were also true and also unkind. And they had 3 or 4 arguments in those first months that started about Clara and ended about things that had been sitting unaddressed for longer than they'd admitted. The argument about his father was one of those. It came out at 2 in the morning during a bad week in October when Evelyn was nursing Clara and Wyatt was leaning against the doorframe wanting to help and having nothing to offer, and she said something about how he'd been withdrawing again all week, and he said he hadn't been, and she said he had. And he said she was reading withdrawal into exhaustion, and she said she knew the difference by now. And then she said, "You do this when something's bothering you that you don't want to name. You've been doing it since the first week of October, and I think I know what it is." "What is it then?" he said, not gently. "Clara was born in August," she said. Your mother died in October, years ago, I know. But it's October and you have a daughter, and I think it's hitting you, and you're doing what you do." He stood in the doorway for a moment. Clara had stopped fussing and was eating with the focused efficiency that was already her signature approach to anything involving food. "That's not something I want to talk about," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to talk about it right now. I'm just saying I know what it is." A pause. "So that you don't have to manage it alone." He stood there for another moment. Then he pushed off the doorframe and came into the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his daughter eating and his wife, who was exhausted and who had just correctly identified something he'd been successfully hiding from himself for weeks. "I keep thinking she would have liked this," he said. His mother. It came out simpler than he'd thought it would. "The baby, the ranch the way it is now, she would have—" He stopped. "I know," Evelyn said quietly. "I don't think about her much," he said. "I put it somewhere a long time ago." "I know that too," she said. They sat in the quiet room with the lamp turned low and the night outside and Clara working steadily at the business of being alive, and Wyatt said nothing more because there wasn't more to say. And Evelyn didn't push for more because she understood when the thing that needed doing had been done. Hot. By the summer of 1892, the ranch was a different thing than it had seen in the summer of 1889. Not transformed, that would have been too clean a word for it. It had the same fence line, the same 43 acres, the same creek along the east side, the same basic structure of a working cattle ranch in a valley that had its hard years and its better ones and never gave anyone a long, uninterrupted run of easy. But the architecture of daily life had shifted in ways that were structural rather than decorative. Evelyn had expanded the bakery kitchen in the spring, using the money Wyatt had paid back from the barn repair plus a surplus from the hotel contract, which had grown. The hotel had added a restaurant and needed more than rolls now. She'd hired a girl named Nora, 17 years old and quick learning, to help with the morning production, which meant Evelyn's 4 a.m. starts could occasionally become 5:30, which was a change she'd been unwilling to ask for and deeply glad to have. The ranch had taken on 2 yearlings from the Sutton operation in a partnership arrangement that meant shared labor at branding and roundup and slightly better purchasing leverage at the feed supplier. It wasn't a formal partnership. Dale and Wyatt were both too independent for that, and both knew it, but it was a consistent working relationship that had grown out of the committee meetings and the fence dispute and the general accumulation of showing up for each other when it mattered. Frank Ridley had kept his land. He was 3 years into his 5-year repayment schedule and was meeting it, barely, with a leaner operation than he'd run before. He'd sold the 2 eastern sections of his North Range, not to Barrett, who had moved his attention elsewhere after the county bank deal closed off that avenue, but to a young couple from Missouri named Taggart, who came with some money and genuine intention to make it work. The Taggarts were quiet and careful, and turned out to be the kind of neighbors who paid attention before they spoke, which was more than anyone had a right to expect on short acquaintance. Ridley himself had become something else in the process, less loud, less certain, more present in a way that was harder to describe. He'd started coming to the Sunday meetings at the Sutton place, the informal gatherings that had grown out of the irrigation committee and had turned into something more general, a loose, irregular assembly of people who found it useful to know what was happening in the valley and to hear what other people were thinking about it. He didn't dominate those meetings anymore. He sat and listened, mostly, and when he said something, it tended to be from experience rather than volume. He'd also, in the fall of 1891, brought a haunch of venison to the Mercer house with no explanation and no ceremony, left it on the porch step, and ridden away. Wyatt had found it and told Evelyn, and she'd said, "That's his version of a thank you." He'd thought about that for a while. Clara, at 11 months old, was attempting to walk with the aggressive determination of someone who had decided the floor was an insult, and she intended to stop being subject to it. She was not succeeding yet, not consistently. There was a great deal of sitting down that happened with the particular expression of a person who was not going to acknowledge that sitting down had been involuntary, but she was working the problem with a focus that made Wyatt think of Evelyn, which made Evelyn laugh when he said so. "She has your stubbornness," Evelyn said. "She has your stubbornness," he said. Mine is quieter." "Your stubbornness is the kind that just quietly does the same thing for 6 years without acknowledging it's doing anything," she said. "Hers is more efficient. He couldn't argue with that. The letter from Barrett's land company arrived in September of 1892. It was not addressed to Wyatt. It was addressed to Evelyn at the bakery address, and it came through the county clerk's office, which meant it had a formal quality that was more than a business inquiry. It concerned the Hart property. Evelyn read it twice before she brought it home, and she showed it to him without preamble, her face doing the controlled, neutral expression that she used when something had landed hard and she was deciding how to respond to it. Barrett's company, operating now under a different corporate name but with the same principles, as Pruitt would later confirm, was claiming a defect in the original Hart property title. Clarence Hart had purchased the land in 1858 from a man named Sutherland, whose title had come from a land grant that the company now claimed had an irregular issuance. The argument was technical and complex, and it was designed to be both, because technical complexity was the mechanism. The letter proposed that in light of the title question, the company would offer to purchase the property at assessed value to resolve the uncertainty. Wyatt read it 3 times. "They're going after your mother's house," he said. "Yes," Evelyn said, "because they couldn't get Ridley's land, so they found the next vulnerable title in the corridor." She had already worked this out. He could see it in her face. The calculation was done. The anger was behind the neutral expression, and she was already at the stage of deciding what to do. "The railroad survey," he said. "How far south does it run?" "Pruitt's going to tell us," she said. "I wrote to him this afternoon. I want to see the full corridor map before I say anything to Mother." "Good." He set the letter down. "Is the original deed at your mother's house?" "In the tin box in the cellar. Same place it's been for 30 years. "We need a copy of it. And the Sutherland transfer documents if they exist." He looked at her. "How much does your mother know?" "Nothing yet." The letter came to the bakery. Evelyn looked at the letter on the table. "She's 63 years old and she buried her husband 2 years ago and she's in that house alone. I'm not telling her until I have something more than a company's claim and a threat dressed up as a courtesy." "She's going to want to know," he said. "She's going to find out," Evelyn said. "I'm deciding when and with what." A pause. "This is my decision, Wyatt." He heard the line in it. He could feel the want in himself to start organizing, to get Pruitt on the line, to go get the deed tonight, to start building the response before Evelyn had finished deciding how she wanted to approach it. That was his instinct, had always been his instinct, and it was useful in some situations and wrong in this one. "Okay," he said. "Tell me what you need from me." She looked at him. The neutrality softened slightly. "Go get the deed tomorrow morning," she said. "Before Mother's up if you can. The tin box is on the left side of the cellar, second shelf." A pause. "And don't say anything to Dale yet, not until we know what we're dealing with." "All right." "And—" She stopped. "What?" "Don't tell me it's going to be fine," she said. "I know you're going to want to, and I know you mean it. But I need to sit with how bad it might be before I can think clearly about what we do." He nodded. "I won't." She picked up Clara from the blanket on the floor where she'd been working at the standing problem and held her, and Clara immediately grabbed a fistful of her mother's hair and held on with the conviction of someone who had found a reliable handhold and intended to keep it. Evelyn rested her chin on Clara's head and looked out the window at the September evening, at the creek and the cottonwoods and the Hart house just visible through the trees, and Wyatt sat at the table and said nothing and let her think. Pruitt wrote back in 4 days. The railroad survey corridor did run south of the Ridley property. It ran directly through the eastern third of the Heartland, the kitchen garden side, the side where the creek crossing was, the side where 30 years of a family's life was in the soil. Barrett's company had found their angle. The title defect claim was almost certainly constructed rather than discovered. Pruitt used the words manufactured ambiguity in his letter, which was legal language for what Wyatt would have called a lie. But constructed or not, it would require a legal response to defeat, which meant cost and time and the particular exhaustion of fighting people who were well-resourced and patient and had done this before. "How much?" Evelyn said when Pruitt came out to discuss it in person. Pruitt gave a range. It was not a small range. Evelyn looked at the number for a moment, then she looked at Wyatt. He looked back at her. "We have it," he said. "Between the bakery account and what I can pull from the cattle sale in October. We have it." It'll clean us out, she said. Yes, he said. If we lose, we spent that money for nothing and we still lose the land. If we don't fight it, we lose the land without trying, he said. And your mother's out of her house. A long pause. This is why they picked us, Evelyn said. Not to Wyatt, to the room, to the general situation, to the fact of what Barrett's people had calculated. They picked a widow and a small ranch because they thought the cost of fighting would make us fold. They made a bad calculation, Pruitt said mildly. Evelyn looked at the letter one more time. Then she set it face down on the table. File the response, she said. We're fighting. Outside, the creek ran past the two properties as it always had. The same water that had been running there since before any of them arrived, and would be running there long after, indifferent to deeds and claims and the particular calculations of people who confused money with power. The cottonwoods were turning now, the September light catching the yellow at the edges of the leaves, and the Hart house stood in it the same way it had stood in every season Wyatt had known, ordinary and solid and worth the fight. He reached across the table and covered Evelyn's hand with his, and she turned her palm up and held on, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say that the holding didn't already say better. Pruitt filed the legal response to Barrett's company in the first week of October 1892, and the waiting began. It was not a clean waiting. It was the kind that lived inside everything else. Inside the morning cattle check, and the bakery accounts, and the Tuesday and Friday visits to Margaret's house, and the particular hour after Clara went to sleep when Wyatt and Evelyn sat at the kitchen table and talked through whatever needed talking through. The legal proceeding sat underneath all of it like a stone in a boot, present even when you weren't thinking about it, making everything else slightly harder than it would have been otherwise. Pruitt had told them clearly that the case had merit. The Sutherland title chain was clean. He'd traced it back through the original land grant and found the Barrett Company's claim defect was built on a misreading of the grant language that was either incompetent or deliberate, and in his professional opinion, it was the latter. The problem was that merit was not the same as outcome, and the Barrett Company had a lawyer named Croft, who had spent 20 years in Sacramento making legitimate claims disappear and illegitimate ones survive, and who was going to make this as expensive and prolonged as the economics required. Evelyn had told Margaret in the second week of October after Pruitt confirmed the filing. She'd gone alone, told Wyatt she needed to do it without him, that Margaret would receive it better one-on-one, and she'd come home 3 hours later and sat down and said it had gone about as well as expected, which meant it had been hard. How is she? Wyatt asked. Angry, Evelyn said, which is better than frightened. She'll be frightened later, but right now she's angry, and that's useful. Margaret's anger turned out to be more than emotionally useful. She appeared at Pruitt's office 2 days after Evelyn told her, without announcement, and laid in front of him a collection of documents she'd kept in the tin box alongside the deed. Letters from Sutherland to Clarence Hart written at the time of purchase, a survey note from the original county mapper that post-dated the grant language Barrett's company was disputing, and a handwritten receipt for the purchase price signed by both parties and witnessed by two names that, when Pruitt ran them down, turned out to be a former county commissioner and a man who had subsequently become a territorial judge. Pruitt called Wyatt the next afternoon and said, in the measured tone of a lawyer who was not given to enthusiasm, "Your mother-in-law may have just changed the shape of this case." The survey note was the critical piece. It established the physical boundaries of the original grant in terms that made Barrett's claimed ambiguity not ambiguous at all. The language their company had called uncertain was resolved by the survey notation in a way that any county judge reading both documents would understand immediately. It didn't make the case over, not yet, but it meant the Barrett Company's position depended on keeping those documents invisible, and they were no longer invisible. Croft, Barrett's lawyer, requested a delay in the first hearing when Pruitt filed the supplemental documentation. The delay was granted, which was standard, but the request itself had a quality that Pruitt described as a man checking whether the door he planned to walk through was as open as he'd thought. They're reassessing, Pruitt said at the kitchen table on a November Sunday. That's what the delay is. Reassessing toward what? Wyatt said. Toward whether the cost of continuing is worth the outcome. Pruitt folded his hands on the table in the way he had when he was making a precise point. They picked this title because they thought it was soft. The survey note makes it harder. The witness names make it harder still. Nobody wants a dead territorial judge's handwriting being discussed in a county courtroom if they're manufacturing a title defect. A pause. They may offer to settle. We're not settling, Evelyn said. She said it from across the kitchen where she was putting Clara down for the evening. She hadn't looked up. She'd heard enough. Pruitt looked at Wyatt. What she said, Wyatt said. Done. The first hearing was in December, rescheduled twice by Croft's office for reasons that were procedurally legitimate and strategically transparent. They drove to the county seat on a cold Tuesday morning, Wyatt and Evelyn and Pruitt, and sat in the courtroom while Croft presented Barrett's position to a judge named Harlan, who was 60 years old and had the expression of a man who had heard most varieties of legal argument in his career and was not easily impressed by any of them. Croft was good. Wyatt had been prepared for that by Pruitt, but good in person was different from good in description. He was precise and articulate, and he had a way of making the manufactured ambiguity sound like genuine legal uncertainty, of presenting Barrett's company as a reasonable party seeking resolution of a legitimate question rather than what it actually was. Wyatt sat in the gallery and watched and felt the particular frustration of seeing something dishonest performed competently. Pruitt was better. He presented the Sutherland letters, the survey note, the witness purchase receipt, in sequence and without drama, and he walked Judge Harlan through the grant language and the survey notation side by side and said, in the plainest possible terms, that there was no ambiguity in the title once both documents were read together, and that the only way to find an ambiguity was to read one without the other, which the Barrett Company had done, and which he would ask the court to note had the shape of a choice rather than an oversight. Harlan looked at the documents for a long time. Then he looked at Croft and said, Counsel, your client's position appears to depend substantially on the survey notation not existing. It exists. Do you want to request another continuance, or would you like to address that now? Croft requested a continuance. Harlan granted 2 weeks and told both parties he expected a substantive response to the survey notation at the next appearance, not a procedural one. Driving home, Pruitt said the case was turning. Not over. He wouldn't say over yet, but turning. Evelyn looked out the window at the winter landscape moving past and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, My father kept those letters for 34 years. He kept everything in that tin box. Every document, every receipt, every letter that had anything to do with the property. A pause. I used to think he was just like that, just orderly. I didn't think about why. He knew land could be contested, Wyatt said. He knew because it had been contested before, she said. Not his land, but he'd seen it happen to other people when he first came here. He told me once, I was maybe 12, he said, paper outlasts memory and memory outlasts trust. I didn't know what he meant then. Wyatt thought about that for a while. Paper outlasts memory. Clarence Hart had been putting paper in a tin box for 34 years against a contingency that came to pass 2 years after he died, and the paper was there waiting. He knew, Wyatt said. He knew, Evelyn said. The settlement offer came in January. Barrett's company, through Croft, proposed to withdraw the title claim entirely in exchange for a permanent right-of-way easement across the northeast corner of the Hart property, a strip of land approximately 15 feet wide along the creek bank, which would provide access for the railroad survey corridor without requiring ownership of the full parcel. Pruitt brought it to the kitchen table and laid it out without recommendation, which was his practice. He presented options and their consequences and let his clients decide. Wyatt looked at Evelyn. She was reading the proposal with the focused attention she gave to anything financial, her face doing the interior processing. What's the easement worth to them? She said to Pruitt. It's the access point for the survey corridor, Pruitt said. Without it, the eastern route has a problem. The alternative route adds 3 miles and crosses a geological feature that the railroad engineers aren't happy about. So the 15 feet is the fulcrum, she said. In practical terms, yes. And if we say no? They continue the case, Pruitt said. My professional opinion is that we win, but professional opinions are not guarantees, and continuing means more cost and more time. A long pause in the room. Clara was asleep. The fire was doing what fires do on January evenings. Outside, the creek was frozen over again, not as thoroughly as the bad winter 2 years ago, but frozen. What does Margaret want? Wyatt asked Evelyn. I haven't told her about the offer yet, she said. But I know what she wants. She wants them gone from her title and off her land. She looked at the easement terms again. A 15-foot strip along the creek bank, that's the north fence line, essentially. It doesn't touch the garden, doesn't touch the house, doesn't affect the crossing. It's still her land under their feet, Wyatt said. I know. She set the paper down. But the alternative is a year of court, another 10 months of this sitting under everything, and a result that Pruitt says we probably win. She looked at Pruitt. Probably, he confirmed without apology. Law is not mathematics. Evelyn sat with it for 3 days. She talked to Margaret, who had exactly the reaction Wyatt had predicted. Initial fury at the idea of giving Barrett's people anything, followed by a long silence, followed by the question, does it end it? And when Evelyn said it ends it, Margaret sat in her chair and looked at her hands and said, after a while, that Clarence would have thought it through and taken the practical outcome over the principle when the principle cost more than it returned. She's right, Evelyn told Wyatt that evening. He was a practical man. So are you, he said. I know, she said. I'm just making sure I'm being practical for the right reasons, and not because I'm tired. Are you tired? Yes, she said. But that's not why. They accepted the settlement. The easement was recorded, the title claim withdrawn, the case closed. Croft's office sent the paperwork without additional communication, which was the legal equivalent of a man leaving a room without making eye contact. Pruitt filed the final documents and sent a letter that ended with the sentence, "The heart title is clear," which was 6 words and sufficient. Margaret received the news in her kitchen, with her hands around a coffee cup and her eyes on the window that looked out at the yard. Her husband had built a garden in the first spring they were on the land. She didn't say much. She said, "Good." And then she said, "Your father would be pleased." And then she changed the subject to whether the creek crossing was going to need regrading before spring, which was her way of returning to the world of practical things that needed managing, which was where Margaret Hart had always lived most comfortably. Mom! The years that followed had the quality that good years have. Not dramatic, not without difficulty, but solid in a way that accumulated rather than depleted. The ranch grew incrementally. 2 more acres of the adjacent land that had come available in 1894 when the family that held it decided to go back to Ohio. A second small barn built properly this time with treated lumber and sound framing. A reliable working relationship with the Taggart operation east of the old Ridley Range that made the fall roundup manageable for both of them. Evelyn's Bakery had become, by the mid-1890s, the kind of institution that a town doesn't notice it has built until it tries to imagine not having it. She'd trained Nora thoroughly enough that Nora could run the morning production independently, which meant Evelyn's hours had a different shape. Still early, still long, but with more room in them for the other things. She'd started in 1894 a once-a-month bread distribution to 3 families in the valley who were going through hard times, organized quietly and without announcement, the kind of thing that didn't appear in any public record, but that people knew about, and that had a way of stabilizing the texture of a community without anyone being able to point to the mechanism. Clara grew up on the ranch in the specific way that children grow up in working places, absorbing the rhythms of it before they're old enough to understand them, knowing how to read cattle and weather and the particular sound a fence makes when it's about to give before they know how to read a book. She was a direct child, which surprised nobody, and a stubborn one, which surprised nobody either. And she had her mother's patience with other people and her father's preference for doing things herself before asking for help, which was a combination that Evelyn said would serve her fine as long as she learned when to set down the stubbornness and let someone else carry the load for a minute. "How do you learn that?" Clara asked once at the table when she was about 7 years old, and they were talking about something unrelated that had shifted into that territory. "Usually by being stubborn for too long and finding out it cost you something," Evelyn said. "Did you do that?" "Yes." "Did Papa?" Evelyn looked at Wyatt. "Yes," Wyatt said, "for about 6 years." "What did it cost you?" "Time," he said, "which is the thing you can't get back." Clara considered this with the focused expression she brought to things that had the quality of being more important than they first appeared. Then she went back to eating, which was also her mother's habit. Receive the information, process it internally, move on. A second child came in 1895, a boy they named Clarence, which made Margaret cry in the efficient way she cried. briefly, completely, and then done with it. He was quieter than Clara from the start, a more watchful child, the kind who sat in corners and observed before he participated, which Wyatt recognized with a particular recognition. He spent more deliberate time with the boy than he might have otherwise, not to change him. The watching and thinking were not flaws to be corrected, but because he understood from the inside what it felt like to be that kind of person and how easily it could calcify into something lonelier than it needed to be. He took Clarence out on the early rounds with him the same way Evelyn had come in the difficult months after her father died. No requirement to talk, just the company of being together in the working morning. The boy would walk beside him checking the water troughs and the fence line, and sometimes he'd ask questions and sometimes he'd say nothing for an hour, and both were fine. Evelyn watched this from the kitchen window sometimes and felt something she didn't always have words for. It was not precisely happiness. Happiness was too simple a word for what she felt watching her husband teach their son how to be present without pretending to be something different than he was. It was more like the satisfaction of a thing coming full circle. Wyatt had spent years alone inside his own quietness, and now he was standing in a field in the early morning, showing his son that the quietness was not a prison. That was, she thought, the thing about him that had taken the longest to understand and that she valued most. He was not a man who changed easily or completely. He still went quiet when things were hard. He still defaulted to the ledger when he was anxious, still reached for the practical solution before the emotional one, still had mornings when she could feel the wall going up and had to decide whether to walk into it or wait it out. He had not been remade by marriage or by children or by the years of hard things and better things that had come through their house. He was still largely who he had been when he drove fence posts along the east pasture and watched her fight her garden fence from a careful distance. But there were things he could do now that he hadn't been able to do before. He could sit with uncertainty without immediately needing to resolve it. He could say what was bothering him, in words, when it mattered enough. He could be in a room with someone who was hurting and not try to fix it before he'd finished listening. These were not large transformations. They were small and specific and hard-won, and they made an actual difference in the daily texture of the life they'd built. She had her own accounting to do. She was not the same person who had planted winter squash in the garden that June morning and watched him come across the creek with fence posts. She was more willing now to ask for what she needed and less likely to manage around the asking until the managing became its own kind of burden. She had learned, by way of living with a man who struggled to say difficult things, that not saying them didn't make them smaller. It just made them accumulate until the weight was harder to carry than the saying would have been. She'd known that in theory for a long time. She'd learned it by example, watching Wyatt work toward it year by year, which was a strange and useful kind of education. It was the summer of 1897 that Wyatt found himself standing at the creek bank on a late afternoon in August and noticing what was there to notice. He was 57 years old. No, wait, 37. He had to stop and do the arithmetic because time had developed a different quality in the last few years. Not moving faster exactly, but accumulating differently, the way a river changes depth without changing direction. He was 37 years old, and he had been on this land for most of his life. And the land looked the way land looks when it has been worked honestly and not abused. Not beautiful in the picture book sense, not dramatic, just solid and cared for and real. Behind him, the ranch house had a lamp in the kitchen window, which was Evelyn finishing the account book she did on Thursday evenings. Clara was at the Hart house with Margaret, who had taken on the project of teaching her granddaughter to cook in the methodical, unsentimental way that Margaret approached everything, which Clara had described to Wyatt as pretty interesting, actually, which was high praise from a 7-year-old. Clarence was somewhere in the barn with Gus's replacement, a younger dog, also named Gus in the tradition he'd apparently established without meaning to, doing whatever a 5-year-old and a livestock dog got up to in a barn at twilight. The creek was running at the right level for August, not the drought low of 1889, not the flood high of the bad winter's aftermath, just running, the way it ran when things were as they should be. He thought about what this place had been 8 years ago. He thought about the man he'd been in the summer of 1889, standing on this same bank watching a woman fight her garden fence and telling himself it wasn't the right time. He thought about what not right time had cost in the years before he finally crossed the water, not just the years without Evelyn, but the specific quality of a life spent managing around the things that mattered most, keeping everything at a functional distance, confusing the absence of loss with the presence of something good. He understood now, very good at the wrong thing for a long time. He'd been good at surviving, at maintaining, at keeping the fence line intact and the cattle fed and the mortgage current and the whole careful structure of a solitary life operational. He'd been so good at it that he'd convinced himself it was enough, that the absence of pain was the same as the presence of life, that a man who didn't want anything he could lose was a man in a strong position. He'd been wrong about that. Not in a way that was easy to see from the inside. From the inside, it had looked like resilience, like practicality, like the hard-earned wisdom of a man who'd lost enough to know better than to need too much. But it wasn't any of those things. It was just fear with a work ethic. The difference between fear with a work ethic and actual courage was, in his experience, one specific thing: the willingness to want something you could lose. Not in the abstract, not as a philosophical position, but in the daily practical reality of choosing to love people and build things and care about outcomes that were not guaranteed, knowing the whole time that the caring itself was what made the possible loss unbearable, and that the possible loss was not a reason not to care. He'd learned that from Evelyn, who had never once pretended that caring less was the same as being stronger, who had sat at his kitchen table in the months after her father died and come on the early rounds in the cold dark, not because she was over it, but because she was in it and needed the company of someone who wasn't going to require her to be fine, who had looked at the Barrett Company's settlement offer and taken 3 days to decide, not because she was uncertain about the law, but because she was making sure she wasn't choosing the practical outcome for the wrong reasons, which was the kind of self-examination that took real honesty, and which he'd watched her do his entire adult life without ever making a production of it. She was not an easy person, in the way that direct, honest people are not easy. She said the thing. She had the argument when the argument was necessary. She didn't let the comfortable untruth sit long enough to become load-bearing. These were qualities that required something from him, something he hadn't been prepared to give when she was just his neighbor across the creek, and he was telling himself it wasn't the right time. And the requiring had been, he thought now, the point. He hadn't needed someone to make his life easier. He'd needed someone who made it more honest. He'd told her that once, in the sideways way he sometimes found to say important things. Not at a significant moment, not with ceremony, just at the kitchen table on an ordinary evening, out of whatever internal current had brought it to the surface. He'd said he thought she'd made him more honest by existing near him, and she'd looked at him over her account book and said, "You made yourself more honest. I just made it worth it." And then she'd gone back to the accounts. He hadn't known what to do with that, except carry it, which he'd done ever since. The valley itself had changed in the 8 years since the drought of 1889. Not dramatically. The ridgelines were the same, the creek ran where it always had, the particular quality of the light in late summer was the same light it had always been. But the human texture of it was different in ways that were visible if you'd been there long enough to have a before. The Ridley operation had stabilized. Frank was 58 now and had been running lean for 5 years and had developed, in the process, a cleaner relationship with his own limitations than he'd had before everything went sideways. He still had opinions and still expressed them, but the volume had dropped and the listening had increased. And the man who showed up to Sunday meetings at the Sutton place was recognizably the same person who dominated those early irrigation committee meetings, and also recognizably not. The Taggart family on the eastern parcel had put down roots in the way of people who'd come to a place and decided it was the place. They had 2 children now, and a third started, and they'd built a second structure on the property that functioned as a small school 3 mornings a week for the children of 4 neighboring operations, which had been Margaret Taggart's idea, and which the valley had received with the gratitude of people who understood what it meant to have to drive children 40 minutes to town for schooling in the winter months. The Barrett Company had not returned. Whether they'd found easier targets elsewhere in the territory, or whether the Harlan hearing had been reported back to their Sacramento principals in terms that made Redstone Valley look like more trouble than the railroad right-of-way was worth, Pruitt couldn't say definitively. But there had been no further title inquiries, no further letters, no further presence of anyone connected to that network in the valley. The easement along the creek bank sat in the county records, a 15-foot strip of land with a railroad company's name on the right-of-way, and the railroad itself had been built, not through the original eastern route, which had been modified during the survey, but through a slightly different alignment that used the easement access but didn't require anything more. It was in the end just a strip of land beside a creek, and the creek ran past it the same way it ran past everything else. Margaret Hart was 68 years old and had no intention of going anywhere. She'd planted a new apple tree in the spring of 1896 to replace one that had died, which Wyatt had noted as a statement of intent. You don't plant apple trees if you're planning to leave. She had dinner at the ranch house on Sunday evenings, which had become the standing arrangement, and she sat at the table with Clara and Clarence and Evelyn and Wyatt and ate without ceremony and said what she thought and laughed when something was funny and was, in the way of certain kinds of people, entirely herself at all times with no apparent difficulty. She had said to Wyatt once, this was 2 years ago, in her kitchen on a Friday morning visit, with a matter-of-factness that was entirely her, "You were slow." He'd known what she meant. "I know," he said. "But you got there," she said. "Clarence always said you would. He said you were the kind of man who moved slow and moved once." She poured more coffee without asking if he wanted it. He was right about most things. He was, Wyatt said. "She was always going to wait you out," Margaret said. "Even if she'd gone to Portland. That wouldn't have been—" She stopped. "She would have done it if it came to that. She would have made a life, but she would have waited to see if you came to your senses first." He thought about that. About the version of events where he'd stood on the Grange Hall porch and said, "Not right now," and gone home. And the letter from Rose Arden had become a decision rather than a question. It was not a comfortable thing to think about. "I'm glad I didn't make her wait longer," he said. "So am I," Margaret said. And she went back to whatever she'd been doing, because Margaret Hart did not linger on things once they were said. Chum. The sun was almost down when Wyatt finally turned away from the creek and started walking back toward the house. The lamp in the kitchen window had been joined by a second light. The sitting room, which meant Evelyn had finished the accounts and moved on to something else. Probably the letter she'd been writing to Rose Arden's partner in Portland, with whom she'd maintained a correspondence over the years that had become a genuine professional friendship. Two women who'd built something in their respective places and found it worth discussing. Clarence came out of the barn with Gus at his heels and fell into step beside his father without saying anything, which was his way. They walked across the yard in the early dark, the dog moving between them with the undiscriminating affection of a good livestock dog. "Papa," Clarence said. "Yeah." "Is the creek supposed to be lower in August?" "Usually, yes. It goes up in spring and drops through the summer." "How do you know when it's too low?" "Experience," Wyatt said. "And you keep records, so you can compare." "Of what?" "Water level, pasture condition. How the cattle are doing." He thought about how to say the next part in a way that was useful rather than just abstract. "You keep track of things over time, so you can tell the difference between what's normal and what's a problem before the problem gets big." Clarence walked alongside him thinking about this. He had the focused quiet of a child processing something properly. "What if you don't notice in time?" he said. "Then you deal with what you have," Wyatt said, "and you try to notice sooner next time." "Did you ever not notice in time?" A pause. The honest answer was yes, and in ways that had nothing to do with creek levels or cattle. "Yes," he said. "More than once." "What happened?" "Sometimes I got a second chance," he said. "Sometimes I had to live with the cost of being slow." He looked at his son, who was 5 years old and asking questions that were going to matter more when he was 20 and 30 and 40, if he remembered to keep asking them. "The point isn't to be perfect. The point is to keep paying attention." Clarence nodded with the seriousness of a child who was filing something away. They went inside. Evelyn was at the desk in the sitting room with the letter, and she looked up when they came in. She looked at Wyatt first, the way she always did. That quick read she did, assessing the quality of his mood with the practiced eye of someone who had been paying close attention for 8 years. Whatever she found seemed satisfactory because her expression settled into the easy version, the one that wasn't managing anything. "Supper's on the stove," she said. "I'll get Clara from your mother in the morning," he said. "I already sent word. She's staying the night." Evelyn looked at Clarence. "Hands." Clarence went to wash his hands. Wyatt stood in the doorway of the sitting room for a moment, looking at his wife at her desk with the lamp making a warm circle around her, and the letter half written in her clear handwriting, and he thought about all the ways a life adds up. Not in the grand accounting of years and events, not in the things you'd tell a stranger if they asked how it had gone, but in the daily accumulated weight of showing up and being honest and doing the work and choosing over and over. The people and the place you'd decided were worth the cost of caring. He'd almost missed it. That was the thing he carried. Not as a wound, not anymore, but as a fact that kept the rest of it honest. The knowledge of how close he'd come to building a life that was functional and empty, to manning the fence line of his own loneliness until it was too late to ask if something better was possible. He'd been afraid, and the fear had looked like practicality, and the practicality had looked like strength, and the strength had looked like enough. Right up until the moment he'd watched a woman fight a garden fence from across a creek and felt something loosen in him that had been tight for years and understood. Finally, that the fear had never been about loss. It had been about wanting something badly enough that losing it would matter. And the solution to that fear was not to stop wanting. It was to find out what happened when you wanted something anyway and said so out loud. What happened was this. A woman in a garden with dirt on her apron who told him she'd been waiting for years and had had the conversation in her head 60 times. A kitchen that smelled like bread and coffee on Thursday mornings. A barn wall that fell down in a storm and a second one built better. A daughter who ate with focused efficiency and a son who asked good questions in the early morning. A mother-in-law who told him he was slow and made him coffee anyway. A valley that had been through drought and hard winters and the particular bad faith of people who saw other people's vulnerability as opportunity, and had come through it with its essential character intact because enough people in it had decided, at enough critical moments, to hold. He crossed the room and kissed his wife on the top of her head, which she accepted with the slight, irritated gesture of someone whose writing had been interrupted and who was not actually irritated. "You're in the way of the lamp," she said. He moved. He went to the kitchen and stirred the pot on the stove and set the table for 3 and listened to his son telling the dog something complicated from the next room and waited for the ordinary evening to do what ordinary evenings did, accumulate, quietly, into something worth having. This was the life he had almost missed. Not the dramatic version, not the story anyone would particularly tell at a gathering. Just this: the lamp, the stove, the sound of a child and a dog, a woman at her desk finishing a letter in her clear handwriting, the creek outside in the dark doing what it had always done. He'd spent years looking for the right time, and what he'd found was that the right time had been any time at all. Any morning he could have walked across 20 feet of shallow water and said the true thing. The courage he'd needed had not been the kind that comes from certainty. It had been the kind that comes from accepting that certainty isn't part of the offer. You cross the creek not knowing. You say the thing not knowing. You build the life not knowing how it comes out, only knowing that not building it is its own kind of answer, and not one you can take back. He had been slow. He had been afraid. He had built a wall and called it strength for 6 years. And then he had walked across a creek on a September morning in a clean shirt with nothing prepared, and everything that mattered had started from there. Outside, the night settled over Redstone Valley the way night settled over working land. Completely, without sentiment, with the indifferent permanence of something that would be there long after everyone who lived under it was gone. The creek moved through the dark. The cattle were quiet in the pasture. Somewhere down the road a neighbor's light was still on, and somewhere else another had gone out, and the valley breathed in the particular rhythm of a place where people were doing what people do, sleeping and worrying and loving each other and building things that might last and trying, in the time they had, to notice what was worth noticing before it was too late to say so. Wyatt Mercer set 3 plates on the table and called his son in for supper, and the dog came too, which was against the rules and happened every night, and the lamp made its circle on the table, and outside the window the creek ran on.